The blizzard came like God's own fury, sweeping across the Colorado mountains with a vengeance that turned day to twilight at 4 in the afternoon. Wind howled through Millbrook's main street, driving needles of ice that cut exposed skin and forced every sensible soul indoors. Only the Golden Eagle Saloon showed signs of life. Yellow lamplight spilling from frost-rimmed windows into the gathering white darkness. Inside, a dozen men huddled around the pot-bellied stove, nursing whiskeys that burned against the bitter cold outside. The usual crowd miners, cattlemen, and the handful of merchants who kept Millbrook from being just another ghost town scattered across the expanding western frontier. The door crashed open, bringing with it a swirl of snow and the silhouette of a man. Tall and broad-shouldered, he stood motionless in the threshold, face hidden beneath a snow-crusted hat, his long black coat whipping around his legs like the wings of a carrion bird. "Close the goddamn door," someone shouted. The stranger stepped inside, pushing the door closed with a measured deliberation that silenced the room. He moved with the careful gait of a man long accustomed to pain, favoring his right leg as he approached the bar. Ice crystals clung to his beard, and his coat, once fine, but now weathered by years of hard use, hung on his frame, like memories of a different life. "Whiskey," he said, his voice a gravel road worn by too many winters. The barkeep, Frank Holloway, slid a glass across the scarred oak bar and poured 3 fingers of amber liquid, without comment. The stranger laid a silver dollar on the counter, its dull gleam catching the lamplight. Only then did he remove his hat, revealing a face that had been handsome once before. Life carved its history into it with a cruel chisel. A jagged scar ran from his right temple down across his cheek, disappearing into his beard. His eyes were the cold blue of glacier ice, and they held the 1,000-yard stare that Frank had seen too many times since the war between the states. Frank's hand froze mid-pour whiskey, splashing onto the bar. "Sweet Jesus Christ," he whispered, the bottle slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. "Winston Harlow, you're supposed to be dead." The saloon fell into a silence so complete that the howling of the blizzard outside seemed to grow louder, like the wailing of ghosts. "I was," Winston replied, downing his whiskey in a single swallow. "For a time. 8 years. 8 long years since Captain Winston Harlow had ridden out with the 7th Cavalry on that mission to Medicine Creek. 8 years since the news had reached Millbrook that the entire detachment had been slaughtered by Cheyenne warriors, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. 8 years since old Rufford Harlow had erected an empty grave with his son's name in the cemetery on the hill. "Someone better go fetch the sheriff," a voice murmured from near the stove. "And tell him what?" another replied. "That we're being haunted." Winston's gaze swept the room, recognition flickering in his eyes, as he catalogued the faces, some familiar, some new, all wary. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "Just passing through on my way home." "Home." Frank found his voice again. "Rufford's place. Christ, Winston, your father's. Dying," Winston finished. "I know. I got a letter from Clement." The silence stretched thin and brittle as winter ice. "When did you get this letter?" asked a balding man seated near the stove, Marcus Beaumont, the town doctor. 3 weeks ago, in Montana." "Then you don't know," Beaumont said, his voice soft, with the practiced gentleness of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. "Rufford passed last Monday. They're burying him tomorrow if this storm lets up." Winston's face remained impassive, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not grief exactly, but something harder and more complex. He poured himself another drink, his movements precise and controlled. "And Clement?" he asked. The glances exchanged around the room told their own story, before anyone spoke. "Your brother's in jail," Frank said at last. "Killed one of Wallace's men 2 weeks back. They're saying he'll hang." Winston nodded, as if this news was merely confirmation of something he'd long suspected. "Wallace," he repeated the name falling from his lips like a curse. "General Thaddeus Wallace is still around then." "Not just around," Beaumont said. "He owns half the county now. Bought up most of the land when the railroad announced its route. Your father's place is scheduled for auction next month. Wallace already holds the mortgage." Winston's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles whitened. "Wallace," he said again, softer this time almost to himself. Of course it would be Wallace. For those who had fought in the war between the states, certain names carried weight that civilians could never fully comprehend. For Winston Harlow, the name Wallace clearly carried the burden of more than simple recognition. "You'd best be careful," Frank warned, leaning across the bar. "Wallace isn't just some land speculator anymore. He's got political ambitions. Running for Senate next year, they say. Got himself a private army of former Union soldiers and Pinkerton men. They're the new law around here." Winston's smile never reached his eyes. Some things never change. He drained his glass and set it down with deliberate care. "I need a horse." "In this storm," Beaumont asked, "you'd freeze before you made it halfway to the Harlow place. I've survived worse." The conversation halted as the saloon door opened again, admitting another snow-covered figure, this one smaller, wrapped in layers of wool and fur. As the newcomer stamped snow from boots and unwound a scarf, the room's attention shifted, revealing a woman in her late 20s with intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. "Dr. Beaumont," she said, her voice crisp with the educated tones of the East Coast. "They told me I'd find you here." "Miss Rowden," Beaumont replied, standing. "Is something wrong at the boarding house?" "Mrs. Peterson's cough has worsened," she said. "She's having difficulty breathing." Winston Harlow turned at the sound of her voice, his gaze sharpening with interest as he studied the woman. Something passed between them, a moment of recognition that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "I'll come right away," Beaumont said, reaching for his coat. The woman, Miss Rowden, was already turning to leave when her eyes locked with Winston's. She froze, her face draining of color, as if she'd seen a specter risen from the grave. "Captain Harlow," she whispered. Winston's brow furrowed. "Do I know you, ma'am?" She recovered quickly, composing her features into a polite mask. "No, sir. I don't believe we've met. Elizabeth Rowden. I'm an artist commissioned to paint General Wallace's portrait for the new courthouse." "Artist," Winston repeated, studying her with new interest. "You have a good memory for faces you've never seen." "I make it my business to know faces," she replied evenly, "especially those of local significance." The charged silence that followed was broken by Beaumont clearing his throat. "Miss Rowden, we should go before the storm worsens." Elizabeth nodded, but her eyes remained on Winston. "They say the dead don't come back, Captain Harlow," she said softly. "Yet here you stand. I wonder what other impossibilities this storm might bring." With that cryptic statement, she followed Beaumont into the howling white darkness, leaving Winston staring after her with narrow-eyed suspicion. "Strange one that Miss Rowden," Frank observed already, sweeping up the broken glass from his dropped bottle. "Showed up about a month ago. Talented artist, they say. Wallace is paying her a small fortune for that portrait." "Wallace," Winston muttered the name like grit between his teeth. "Everything comes back to Wallace." He tossed another coin on the bar. "I still need that horse, Frank. You're really going out in this?" "It's suicide." Winston's smile was grim. "Wouldn't be the first time someone said that to me." An hour later, mounted on a sturdy bay gelding borrowed from Frank's stable, Winston Harlow pushed through snowdrifts that reached the horse's chest in places. The cold had settled into his bones, a familiar companion after years in the Montana mountains. His right leg throbbed where the Minié ball had shattered his femur at Gettysburg, the old wound a reliable barometer for approaching storms. The Harlow Ranch lay 5 miles outside town, once the pride of Rufford Harlow, former plantation owner from Virginia, who'd fled west after the Confederacy's collapse. Winston had left 11 years ago, trading his father's bitter disappointment for a Union Army commission. He'd returned only once briefly before the Medicine Creek Massacre, a visit marked by shouting matches and recriminations that ended with Rufford declaring he had only one son. Now, as the silhouette of the ranch house emerged from the swirling snow, Winston felt nothing but a hollow emptiness where grief should have been. The house stood dark, except for a single lamp burning in the kitchen window. Once grand by frontier standards, the 2-story structure now showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, missing shingles, a sagging porch. Winston dismounted his boots, crunching through the frozen crust of snow as he approached the front door. He didn't knock. This was still Harlow land, Harlow blood, no matter what Wallace might think. The door swung open into darkness that smelled of dust and disuse. Winston struck a match, lighting a lamp that revealed a house that seemed frozen in time. The same heavy furniture, the same faded drapes, the same portrait of his mother above the fireplace, dead 16 years now, though her absence still hung in the air like the lingering notes of a half-remembered song. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing through empty rooms. "Anyone here?" Only silence answered. Winston moved through the house room by room, noting the signs of hasty departure drawers left partially open, empty spaces on shelves where valued possessions had once stood. In his father's study, papers were scattered across the desk, as if someone had searched through them in a hurry. He was examining these when a floorboard creaked behind him. Winston turned, hand dropping to the army colt at his hip, to find Elizabeth Rowden standing in the doorway, a small revolver aimed steadily at his chest. "Don't move, Captain Harlow," she said. "Or should I call you the ghost of Medicine Creek?" "You're following me," Winston observed calmly, as if the gun were of no consequence. "Why?" "I ask the questions," she replied. "Starting with how a man supposedly massacred by Cheyenne warriors 8 years ago is suddenly walking around Colorado." "It's a long story. I have time." Winston's eyes flicked to the window where the blizzard showed no signs of abating. "So it seems." Elizabeth stepped further into the room, keeping the revolver trained on him. She was dressed practically now, in a split riding skirt and heavy woolen coat, her dark hair pulled back from a face that managed to be both delicate and determined. "Start talking, Captain," she demanded, "and understand that while I may be an artist, I learned to shoot from my father, who was a marksman in the Mexican War." Winston studied her for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and lowered himself into his father's chair. "The official report says my detachment was ambushed by Cheyenne warriors at Medicine Creek," he began. 32 men slaughtered, bodies mutilated beyond recognition. A tragedy that justified the subsequent pacification of 3 Cheyenne villages." His voice hardened. "It was a lie." "What happened?" "There was a massacre at Medicine Creek," Winston said, his eyes distant. "But it wasn't the Cheyenne doing the killing." Elizabeth lowered her gun slightly. "Go on." "We were sent to investigate reports of gold theft from a mining operation near Cheyenne territory, official mission from General Wallace himself. But when we arrived..." Winston's jaw tightened. It wasn't a mine we found. It was a slaughter. Nearly 40 Cheyenne men, women, children gunned down. And the killers were still there dressed as cavalry, but not any soldiers I recognized. Wallace's men, Elizabeth said, not a question. Winston's gaze sharpened. You know more than you're letting on. Keep talking. They ordered us to fire on the survivors. When I refused and tried to stop it, all hell broke loose. My own men started shooting at each other. I took a bullet to the shoulder, fell into the creek. Current carried me downstream. By the time I dragged myself out, I was miles away and half dead from blood loss and cold. And you never came back to tell the truth, Elizabeth said, accusation clear in her voice. I tried, Winston countered. Rode to Fort Laramie with bullets still in my shoulder. Reported to the commanding officer there, Colonel Abernathy. Next morning, I was arrested for desertion and murder. They claimed I'd killed my own men in a dispute over gold. Had 3 witnesses ready to testify. His laugh was bitter. I escaped before they could hang me. Spent 8 years in a mining camp in Montana, under a different name. Why come back now? Winston reached into his coat and slowly withdrew a folded letter. Elizabeth tensed, but he merely held it out to her. From my brother, he explained. Said our father was dying, that Wallace was foreclosing on the ranch, and that he'd found something evidence about what really happened at Medicine Creek. Elizabeth took the letter, keeping the gun trained on Winston as she quickly scanned its contents. This is dated over a month ago. I was in the mountains, mails slow. Convenient, she observed. And now your father's dead and your brother's in jail for murder. Leaves you as the last Harlow standing. Winston's eyes narrowed. You think I'm lying? I think there's more to this story, Elizabeth countered. Why would an artist commissioned to paint Wallace's portrait be so interested in a long-forgotten massacre? For a long moment, they measured each other in silence. Then Winston smiled grimly. We both have secrets, Miss Rowden. The question is whether they're the same secret. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the howling wind. Elizabeth moved to the window, peering through frost-rimmed glass. Riders, she said tersely. 6, maybe 7. Coming fast. Winston joined her at the window. Through the swirling snow, he could make out mounted figures approaching the house lanterns bobbing in the darkness. Wallace's men, Elizabeth whispered, a tremor in her voice betraying her calm facade. How do you know? The same men have been watching me since I arrived in Millbrook. She turned to him, urgency replacing suspicion. There's no time to explain. If they find you here... I'm already a dead man, Winston finished. I know. The riders were nearing the house now, shouts carrying through the storm. There's a hidden cellar, Winston said quickly. Behind the pantry, my father's bourbon smuggling operation during the war. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose, but she asked no questions as she followed him through the kitchen to a narrow door that looked like a broom closet. Winston slid aside a false panel revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. Go, he urged. I'll be right behind you. Elizabeth hesitated. Why are you helping me? I just held you at gunpoint. Winston's smile held no humor. Let's just say I'm curious about what Wallace wants with an artist badly enough to send armed men into a blizzard. As the pounding of fists on the front door echoed through the house, Elizabeth descended into the darkness. Winston followed, sliding the panel back into place just as the sound of splintering wood announced that Wallace's men had lost patience with knocking. The hidden cellar was small and damp, lined with dusty shelves that still held a few bottles of Rufford Harlow's contraband bourbon. A narrow tunnel extended from the far wall, an escape route that Winston's father had shown him as a boy, leading to a concealed exit in the stable. We should be safe here until they leave," Winston whispered, lighting a small lantern that cast ghoulish shadows across the earthen walls. Elizabeth stood with her back against the wall, revolver still in hand, watching him with wary eyes. "They won't leave," she said. "Not until they find what they're looking for." "And what would that be?" "A map," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Your father had a map that Wallace wants very badly." Winston frowned. "A map to what?" "To the real Medicine Creek," Elizabeth said softly, "and the 10 million in gold that disappeared there." Before Winston could respond, the sound of furniture being overturned filtered down from above. Heavy boots stomped across floorboards as Wallace's men systematically searched the house. "Captain Harlow," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible above the muffled chaos. "I believe we may be the only two people left alive who know what really happened that day." "And what do you think happened, Miss Rowden?" Winston asked, studying her face in the lantern light. Elizabeth met his gaze unflinchingly. "I think General Thaddeus Wallace ordered the slaughter of innocent people to cover up the theft of Cheyenne gold. I think he then sacrificed your detachment to create a convenient scapegoat. And I think my sister died because she learned the truth." Understanding dawned in Winston's eyes. "Your sister?" "Sarah Rowden, Army nurse stationed at Fort Laramie. She treated a dying soldier who confessed to the Medicine Creek massacre." Elizabeth's voice hardened. 3 days later she was found dead. Suicide, they called it. The cellar fell silent except for the distant sounds of the search above and the soft hiss of the lantern. "I'm sorry about your sister," Winston said finally. "I don't want your sympathy, Captain. I want justice." Elizabeth's grip tightened on her revolver. "And I believe you're the key to getting it." Winston opened his mouth to respond when his gaze fell on something behind Elizabeth, a loose brick in the wall, slightly askew. Moving past her, he worked the brick free, revealing a small cavity containing an oilskin packet. "My father always did love his hiding places," he murmured, unwrapping the packet. Inside was a folded piece of parchment that crackled with age as he carefully opened it. Elizabeth moved closer, the lantern casting their shadows large against the cellar wall as they examined the contents together. It was a map meticulously drawn showing a section of territory in what appeared to be western Colorado. A small creek was marked with an X, and beside it, written in faded ink, "The real Medicine Creek, 10,000 Troy Oz." In the margin, a single sentence in Rufford Harlow's distinctive handwriting, "Wallace knows." "My God," Elizabeth breathed. "It's real." A sudden crash from above made them both jump. The search was growing more destructive. "We need to go," Winston said, carefully refolding the map and tucking it inside his coat. "They'll find this place eventually." Elizabeth nodded, following him toward the tunnel entrance. As Winston bent to clear debris from the narrow passage, she asked, "Why did you stay away for 8 years, if you knew the truth?" Winston paused, not turning to face her. "Same reason you're carrying that revolver," he said quietly. "Self-preservation." "And now?" Winston straightened his profile sharp in the lantern light. "Now, my father's dead. My brother's facing the gallows, and the man responsible is about to become a U.S. senator with enough power to make sure the truth stays buried forever." His eyes, when he turned to her, burned with a cold fire. "I'd say self-preservation is no longer my primary concern." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, then nodded once decision made. "Then we have work to do, Captain Harlow." As they prepared to enter the tunnel, a voice called from above, so close it seemed to be in the kitchen directly over their heads. "Check for hidden panels," a harsh voice ordered. "Wallace says old Harlow was a smuggler during the war. There's bound to be hiding places." Winston extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness broken only by thin slivers of light from between the floorboards above. He took Elizabeth's arm, guiding her toward the tunnel entrance. They had just reached it when the sound of the false panel sliding open echoed through the cellar, followed by the beam of a lantern illuminating the space they had occupied moments before. "Well, well," the voice said, satisfaction evident. "What have we here?" Winston pulled Elizabeth into the tunnel, his voice a breath against her ear. "Run." Behind them, a shout went up. "Down here, I found something." And then they were crawling through the narrow passage, the sounds of pursuit close behind, racing toward an uncertain escape, with a map that men were willing to kill for clutched tightly in Winston Harlow's coat. A dead man carrying the secret that had supposedly killed him 8 years before. The tunnel stretched before them like the throat of some ancient beast, narrow and damp, its earthen walls pressing in from all sides. Winston led the way, one hand extended in the darkness, the other firmly gripping Elizabeth's wrist, as they scrambled forward on hands and knees. Behind them, muffled shouts and the bobbing glow of lanterns grew more distant with each passing moment. "Almost there," Winston whispered, his breath coming in white puffs in the frigid air. The passage had been designed for whiskey smuggling, not for a grown man with a war-damaged leg. Pain shot through Winston's right thigh with every movement, an old friend returning to remind him of mortality. He gritted his teeth and pushed on. After what seemed an eternity, his outstretched hand met wooden planks instead of dirt. "Here," he murmured, pushing against the barrier. For a terrifying moment, it refused to budge, frozen shut, or blocked by years of accumulated debris. Then, with a groan of protesting wood, it swung outward into the howling white void of the blizzard. The stable stood 30 yards from the main house, a dark silhouette barely visible through the swirling snow. Winston pulled himself out of the tunnel, then reached back to help Elizabeth. Her hand was ice-cold in his, but her grip remained firm. "They'll check the stable next," she said, raising her voice over the wind as she brushed dirt from her clothing. Winston nodded, scanning their surroundings. The storm had intensified, a blessing that obscured their tracks almost as quickly as they were made. "We need horses." Inside the stable, the familiar smell of hay and horse brought a rush of memories Winston had spent years trying to forget. 3 horses occupied the stalls, his father's chestnut-gelding Clement's bay mare, and a dappled gray he didn't recognize. "That one's mine," Elizabeth said, moving toward the gray. "Wallace insisted I stable her here instead of in town. Wanted to keep track of my movements." "Smart man," Winston observed, already saddling his father's horse. The animal recognized him, nickering softly and nudging his shoulder in greeting. "Always control the artist painting your portrait." Elizabeth's hands stilled on her saddle. "You understand, then, that portraits reveal more than just appearance?" "Yes." Winston tightened a girth strap with practiced efficiency. "My mother used to say a true portrait shows not the face a person presents to the world, but the soul they try to hide." "Your mother was wise," Elizabeth said softly. "It's why Wallace commissioned me. My reputation precedes me. I paint what I see, not what my subjects wish to see." "And what do you see when you look at Wallace?" Elizabeth's expression hardened. A man with blood on his hands. Before Winston could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of the house. Lantern light cut through the swirling snow, bobbing closer. "They've found the tunnel," Elizabeth said, swinging up into her saddle. Winston mounted his father's horse, wincing as his right leg protested. "Which way to town?" "Town is suicide," Elizabeth countered. "They'll have men watching the roads." "Then where?" Elizabeth hesitated only a moment. "I know a place. Follow me and stay close." They burst from the stable into the teeth of the storm snow, immediately enveloping them in a white shroud. Behind them, Winston heard curses and the sounds of men scrambling to mount horses. He leaned low over his mount's neck, following the gray shadow of Elizabeth's horse as they plunged into the wilderness beyond the Harlow Ranch. The blizzard became both enemy and ally, a blinding obstacle that slowed their progress to a crawl, yet a perfect blanket to cover their escape. Winston lost all sense of direction as they pushed deeper into the foothills, trusting Elizabeth's knowledge and the sure-footedness of their horses. After nearly an hour of grueling travel, Elizabeth reined in her mount, beside a dark shape looming from the snow-covered landscape. As Winston drew alongside, he made out the silhouette of a small cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping. "Trapper's cabin," Elizabeth explained, dismounting stiffly. "Abandoned years ago. I found it while sketching the mountains last month." They stabled the horses in a lean-to beside the cabin, where they would be sheltered from the worst of the storm. The cabin itself was Spartan, but sound, a single room, with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and chairs, and a narrow bed frame covered with a dusty bearskin. Elizabeth moved with the efficiency of someone who had planned for this contingency, retrieving kindling and firewood from a covered stack outside. Within minutes, she had a small fire crackling in the hearth, its light transforming the cabin from a dark cell into a haven against the wilderness. Winston stood by the single window watching the blizzard rage. "We've lost them for now," he said, "but they'll keep searching once the storm breaks." "Which gives us time to plan our next move," Elizabeth replied, removing her gloves and holding her hands toward the fire's warmth, "and to share what we each know about Medicine Creek." Winston turned from the window, studying her with newfound appreciation. "You're not what I expected in an artist, Miss Rowden." "And what did you expect, Captain Harlow? Someone less prepared for running from armed men in a blizzard." Elizabeth's smile held no mirth. "My father was a minister, but he raised me to survive in a world that rarely values women beyond their decorative qualities. Painting portraits of wealthy men taught me the rest: how to read people, how to anticipate their actions, and when to run." She reached into her coat and withdrew a small leather-bound journal. "We should compare notes. I've been investigating Wallace for over a year, ever since the army ruled my sister's death a suicide." Winston nodded, easing himself into a chair by the fire. His leg throbbed mercilessly, the cold and exertion having awakened old wounds. From inside his coat, he removed the oilskin packet containing his father's map. "Let's start with what's certain," he said, spreading the map on the table between them. "Medicine Creek exists, and something there was valuable enough for Wallace to massacre a village and sacrifice his own men to keep it secret." Elizabeth opened her journal, revealing pages of meticulous notes and sketches. "According to my sister's last letter, a soldier named Private James Murdoch confessed to her while delirious with fever. He claimed to have been part of a special detachment under Wallace's direct command, not regular army. They located a massive gold deposit on Cheyenne land." "Not just any gold," Winston added, tapping the map. "My father's note says 10,000 troy ounces. At current prices, that's nearly $200,000. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Enough to buy political influence, certainly. But why not simply claim the land legally?" "Because it wasn't just on Cheyenne land," Winston said grimly. "It was sacred land. The Treaty of Fort Laramie explicitly protected it from mining claims." Understanding dawned in Elizabeth's expression. "So Wallace orchestrated a massacre, blamed it on a Cheyenne uprising, and used that as justification to nullify the treaty protections. And when my detachment arrived ahead of schedule and witnessed the slaughter, Winston's jaw tightened. We became loose ends to be eliminated. Elizabeth leaned forward, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. But something went wrong. You survived. Not just me, Winston said quietly. There were 4 of us who made it out alive that day. This revelation hung in the air between them. 4 survivors, Elizabeth finally said. Where are the others? Winston's expression darkened. Redmond Hayes escaped with me. Last I heard, he'd become a banker in Denver. Martin Caldwell took a bullet to the spine but lived. He was shipped home to his family in St. Louis. And James Fordham, he shook his head. Fordham was Wallace's aide-de-camp. When the shooting started, he ran. I don't know if he survived. So there are potentially 3 other witnesses who could corroborate your story, Elizabeth said, a spark of hope in her voice. If they're still alive, Winston cautioned. And if they're willing to speak. We all made a pact to stay dead, Miss Rowden. Survival depended on Wallace believing he'd silenced everyone. Elizabeth made a note in her journal. We need to find them. Hayes in Denver would be our best starting point. Winston nodded, though doubt clouded his features. 8 years is a long time. Men change, especially men with something to fear. Or something to hide, Elizabeth added pointedly. Their eyes met across the table, mutual wariness tempering their alliance. For all their shared purpose, they remained strangers bound by circumstance, each with reasons to doubt the other's motives. The moment was broken by a sound outside, faint but distinct against the howling wind. A horse's whinny, quickly muffled. Winston was on his feet instantly, hand going to his pistol. Elizabeth doused the lamp with a quick twist of the wick, leaving only the firelight flickering across the cabin walls. Could be just our horses, she whispered, but her hand had already found her revolver. Winston shook his head, moving silently to the window. Through the frost-rimmed glass, he could make out dark shapes moving through the snow, at least 3 mounted figures approaching the cabin. Wallace's men, he murmured. How did they find us in this storm? Elizabeth's face paled. Unless they followed our tracks. No, Winston cut her off. They knew exactly where to look. His eyes locked with hers, sudden suspicion hardening his features. This is your hiding place, Miss Rowden. Who else knows about it? Before she could answer, a voice called from outside, barely audible above the wind. Miss Rowden, we know you're in there. General Wallace requests your immediate return to town. Come out now, and no harm will come to you. Elizabeth's expression flashed from fear to anger. They must have followed me here before when I was sketching. I thought I was being careful. Evidently not careful enough, Winston replied grimly. He assessed their situation with the practiced eye of a soldier. 1 door, 2 windows, limited ammunition, and nowhere to run in a raging blizzard. Options. Back door, Elizabeth said, moving to a corner of the cabin and pulling aside a bearskin rug to reveal a trap door. Root cellar. There's a tunnel the trapper used for checking his lines in bad weather. Leads to a cave about a 1/4 mile up the ridge. Winston raised an eyebrow. You really do plan for everything. I told you Wallace has been watching me since I arrived. She pulled open the trapdoor, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. I never stay anywhere without knowing all the exits. The voice outside called again, more insistent. Last chance? Miss Rowden, come out, or we're coming in. Winston quickly gathered the map and Elizabeth's journal, securing them inside his coat. Ladies first, he said, gesturing to the trapdoor. Elizabeth hesitated. They might burn the cabin once they realize we've fled. Better the cabin than us, Winston countered. Go. She descended quickly, vanishing into the darkness below. Winston followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above them just as the cabin door splintered open. The root cellar was cramped and earthen-smelling, lined with dusty shelves of preserved goods long past consumption. A narrow tunnel barely wide enough for a man's shoulders extended from the far wall. Elizabeth already had a small bullseye lantern lit its beam, illuminating the passage ahead. "Stay close," she whispered. "The tunnel narrows in places." They moved as quickly as the confined space allowed Winston, fighting both claustrophobia and the pain in his leg, as they crawled through sections where the ceiling dipped perilously low. Behind them, muffled thumps and curses filtered down as Wallace's men searched the cabin. "They'll find the trapdoor soon enough," Winston muttered. "By then we'll be long gone," Elizabeth replied, her voice confident despite their predicament. The tunnel gradually sloped upward, the packed earth giving way to stone as they penetrated deeper into the ridge. After what seemed an eternity of crawling through the suffocating darkness, the passage widened into a small cave, its ceiling high enough to stand beneath. Elizabeth's lantern revealed crude tools and supplies stacked against one wall. The trapper's emergency cache. The cave's mouth was sealed with a lattice of branches and hides that allowed minimal light to filter through while remaining virtually invisible from outside. "We'll wait here until they give up," Elizabeth said, moving to peek through a gap in the covering. "In this storm, they can't track us, and they won't risk getting lost in the mountains at night." Winston sank down against the cave wall, stretching his aching leg before him. "Assuming they don't decide to wait us out." "They won't," Elizabeth said with surprising certainty. "Wallace needs them back in Millbrook. Tomorrow is Rufford's funeral, and Wallace will want a strong presence there to maintain appearances." Winston studied her in the lantern light. "You know a great deal about Wallace's movements." "I've been painting his portrait for 3 weeks," she replied. "Men talk freely around artists. We are like furniture to them, present but unnoticed." "And what else have you learned while being furniture?" Winston asked, his tone carefully neutral. Elizabeth hesitated, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. Finally she sighed and sat down across from him. "Wallace is planning something big. He's meeting with investors from back east next week, railroad men, bankers, politicians. There's talk of a new spur line through Millbrook, connecting to the transcontinental." "That would increase land values tenfold," Winston observed. "Precisely. Every property Wallace has acquired in the past year would become immensely valuable overnight, including your family's ranch." Winston's eyes narrowed in thought. "The ranch sits on the most direct route between Millbrook and the main line, perfect for a spur connection." "Which explains why Wallace was so determined to acquire it," Elizabeth added. "Your father must have refused to sell." "Rufford Harlow never sold anything in his life," Winston said, a hint of grudging respect in his voice. "Too stubborn by half." "Like father, like son," Elizabeth observed with the ghost of a smile. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the muted howling of the wind outside the cave and the occasional distant shout from Wallace's men. The lantern cast long shadows as they waited, each lost in private thoughts. After nearly an hour, the sounds of pursuit faded. Elizabeth ventured another look through the cave covering. "They're gone," she reported, heading back toward town. Winston nodded, though he made no move to rise. "We should wait until daybreak. Easier to navigate and less chance of freezing to death." Elizabeth agreed, settling back against the cave wall. "You should rest. I'll take first watch." "I haven't slept soundly in 8 years, Miss Rowden." Old habits die hard. Elizabeth, she said quietly, if we're going to bring down a decorated Union general with political connections, we might as well use first names. Winston studied her for a moment, then nodded. Elizabeth it is. The conversation lulled again, but the silence between them had changed, becoming something less wary, more contemplative. Why did you stay away so long? Elizabeth finally asked. Your family believed you were dead. Winston's face hardened. It was safer that way, for them and for me. But your father. My father and I parted on bitter terms long before Medicine Creek. Winston interrupted. He never forgave me for fighting for the Union while his beloved Confederacy burned. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. Yet he kept that map hidden all these years. He must have known what Wallace did, known you were innocent. Winston had no answer for this, his expression troubled as he considered the implications. Had the old man known the truth all along? Had his final message to Clement been an attempt to clear his firstborn son's name? What about you? He deflected. Most women seeking justice for a murdered sister don't infiltrate a powerful man's inner circle by becoming his portrait artist. Most women don't have many options for seeking justice at all, Elizabeth countered. My choices were limited after my disgrace. Winston raised an eyebrow in silent question. Elizabeth sighed absently, tracing patterns in the dirt floor with her finger. 3 years ago, I was engaged to Thomas Brennan, a banker's son from a good Boston family. I believed myself in love. He took liberties I shouldn't have permitted before our wedding. Her voice hardened. When I discovered him with another woman and confronted him, he spread vicious stories about my character. Men like that rarely change, Winston observed. No, Elizabeth agreed. But they do move up in the world. Thomas Brennan is now Wallace's personal secretary and right hand in all business matters. Winston's eyes narrowed. That's quite a coincidence. I thought so too at first, Elizabeth said, until I realized Brennan is Wallace's nephew. When Sarah's letters about a cover-up at Medicine Creek reached me, I saw an opportunity. Brennan knew me only as Elizabeth Roden, the disgraced minister's daughter from Boston. He had no idea Sarah was my sister. We had different mothers. So you established a reputation as a portrait artist and waited for an opportunity to get close to Wallace, Elizabeth finished. When I heard he was commissioning a portrait for the new courthouse, I called in every favor I had to secure the commission. Winston nodded slowly, newfound respect in his gaze. Clever. And dangerous. No more dangerous than surviving a massacre and living as a dead man for 8 years, she replied with a hint of challenge. Their eyes held for a long moment, mutual understanding passing between them. Two damaged souls united by a common enemy and the ghosts of those they'd lost. The moment was broken by a sudden gust of wind that shook the cave covering, sending a spray of snow across the entrance. Winston rose stiffly, moving to secure the branches. Storm's getting worse, he observed. We're in for a long night. Elizabeth joined him at the cave mouth, peering out at the white fury that had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien wasteland. I've never seen a blizzard this severe, she said softly. Montana gets worse, Winston replied. Up there they call this kind of storm a white hell, beautiful enough to make you stop and stare, cold enough to kill you while you're admiring it. Elizabeth shivered, though whether from the cold or his words was unclear. Like many dangerous things, she murmured. Winston turned to find her watching him, her expression unreadable in the dim lantern light. For a brief moment, something electric passed between them, a recognition of shared purpose that might in different circumstances have been something more. Then Elizabeth turned away, moving back to her place by the wall. "We should conserve the lantern oil," she said, practical once more. "It'll be a long night." Winston nodded, joining her on the cave floor. As the lantern dimmed to a faint glow, the cave grew colder, the wind's howl more pronounced. Without discussion, they moved closer together, for warmth, backs against the wall, shoulders touching. "Tomorrow we ride for Denver," Winston said, his voice low in the darkness. "Find Redmond Hayes. If anyone knows where the gold is now, it'll be him. And after that—" Winston was silent for a long moment. "Justice," he finally said. "For your sister. For my men, for all the others Wallace has destroyed on his path to power." Elizabeth's hand found his in the darkness, a brief, firm squeeze of solidarity. "Justice," she echoed. They fell silent as the storm raged outside, each lost in thoughts of what morning would bring. Neither fully trusted the other. There were too many secrets still between them, too many years of survival through suspicion. But in that cave, with death howling at the door, in the form of a Colorado blizzard, they had found something rare and precious, a single point of truth in a world built on lies. Morning would test that fragile alliance as they ventured into Denver Wallace's territory in search of a man who might already be dead. But for now, they rested, watching shadows dance across the cave walls, waiting for the white hell outside to yield to the cold light of dawn. The Denver of 1876 was a city transformed by gold and ambition, once a rough mining camp, now a burgeoning metropolis with aspirations of greatness. Stone buildings rose alongside wooden facades on streets that buzzed with commerce and opportunity. The territorial capital had grown fat on mining wealth and railroad money, its nouveau riche citizens eager to display their prosperity through European fashions and Eastern manners. Winston and Elizabeth arrived as the city was waking their horses, exhausted from the grueling journey through snow-choked mountain passes. They had traveled through the night once the storm abated, avoiding main roads and keeping to forested ridgelines where possible. Both knew Wallace would have telegraphed descriptions to Denver law enforcement. A dead cavalry officer and a fugitive artist would make conspicuous quarry. "We need to change our appearance," Winston observed as they stabled their horses at a livery on the city's outskirts. "And find Hayes before Wallace's men find us." Elizabeth nodded, already unwinding her hair from its practical bun. With a few expert movements, she rearranged it in the fashionable style of a society matron, instantly transforming her appearance from determined fugitive to respectable lady. "The Denver Mercantile Bank is on Larimer Street," she said, adjusting her riding skirt to appear more like a walking dress. "Hayes is listed as vice president in charge of commercial accounts." Winston surveyed his own trail-worn appearance with a critical eye. "I won't pass for respectable in this state." "Then don't try," Elizabeth advised. "Denver is full of prospectors and mountain men. No one looks twice at another rough character. They're too afraid of offending someone who might have just struck it rich." They separated at the livery stable, agreeing to meet in 2 hours at a small cafe near the bank. Elizabeth would reconnoiter the bank under the guise of inquiring about opening an account, while Winston sought information about Hayes from less official sources. The Denver Winston remembered from his last visit had been a raw, bustling town of opportunity. This new Denver, with its opera house and 4-story hotels, felt alien to him, a symbol of how much the world had changed during his self-imposed exile. He moved through the morning crowds like a ghost, conscious of his frontier appearance, amid the well-dressed businessmen and society ladies who populated the downtown streets. At a saloon near the railway station, Winston found what he was seeking: information traded freely over whiskey and cards. Settling at the bar with a drink he had no intention of consuming, he struck up a conversation with the bartender, a veteran with a Union Army pin on his lapel. "Passing through?" the bartender asked, wiping down the scarred wooden bar. Winston nodded. "Looking up an old war buddy, Redmond Hayes. Heard he made good at the Denver Mercantile." The bartender's expression shifted subtly. "Hayes, huh? Yeah, he did right well for himself. Started as a teller, worked his way up to vice president in just a few years." "Man always had a head for numbers," Winston said easily. "Thought I'd surprise him. Been too long." The bartender leaned in, lowering his voice. "Might be too late for that reunion, friend. Hayes took the quick way out last week. Blew his brains out in his office." Winston's blood ran cold, though he kept his expression neutral. "That doesn't sound like the Red Hayes I knew." "People change," the bartender shrugged. "Word is he had gambling debts. Others say it was woman trouble. Either way, he's getting planted this afternoon. Funerals at 2 o'clock Riverside Cemetery." Winston thanked the man with a generous tip and departed, his mind racing. Hayes's suicide, if it truly was suicide coming so soon after Clement's imprisonment and Rufford's death, couldn't be coincidence. Wallace was tying up loose ends, eliminating anyone who might know the truth about Medicine Creek. He found Elizabeth waiting at the appointed cafe, her face drawn with similar news. "Hayes is dead," they said simultaneously. Elizabeth nodded grimly. "Suicide, they're saying." "Convenient timing," Winston observed. "Did you learn anything else?" "Only that he was acting strangely in the days before his death. His secretary mentioned he'd been receiving unmarked letters that seemed to disturb him greatly." Winston's jaw tightened. "Wallace found him first." "There's more," Elizabeth said, leaning closer across the small table. "I overheard 2 bank directors discussing Hayes's replacement. They mentioned needing someone who would continue the special arrangement with General Wallace." "What kind of arrangement?" "They didn't say, but it sounded like more than just normal banking services." Elizabeth glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "The funeral is this afternoon. We should attend, see who else shows up." Winston agreed, though his instincts screamed caution. Funerals were perfect places for identifying associates, or setting traps for fugitives. They spent the intervening hours separately gathering supplies and information. Winston purchased a decent suit and hat, transforming himself into a passable businessman. Elizabeth acquired more practical clothing for their inevitable flight from Denver, along with ammunition for their weapons. Riverside Cemetery stood on a gentle slope overlooking the South Platte River, its neat rows of headstones offering final views of the mountains to the west. The Hayes funeral was sparsely attended, a few bank colleagues, some society ladies supporting the widow, and a minister delivering platitudes about a man he clearly barely knew. Winston and Elizabeth observed from a respectful distance, positioned to watch both the ceremony and the approaches to the cemetery. Hayes's widow was a small, elegant woman in expensive black crepe, her face hidden behind a heavy veil as she accepted condolences with rigid dignity. "No sign of Wallace," Elizabeth murmured. "He'd never show his face," Winston replied. "But his eyes are here somewhere." As if summoned by his words, a familiar figure appeared at the cemetery gates, tall and distinguished in an expensive black coat with carefully groomed side whiskers, framing a face that had haunted Winston's nightmares for 8 years. "Thomas Brennan," Elizabeth whispered instinctively, stepping back into the shadow of a large monument. Winston studied the man who had ruined Elizabeth's reputation and now served as Wallace's right hand. Brennan moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference, stopping to speak quietly with several mourners before approaching Hayes's widow. "He's Wallace's proxy," Winston observed, "paying respects and gathering intelligence simultaneously. The brief graveside service concluded mourners drifting away in pairs and small groups. Hayes's widow remained at the grave, her hand resting on the polished coffin, as if reluctant to leave her husband to the cold earth. When only the widow and the gravediggers remained, Winston and Elizabeth approached carefully. Mrs. Hayes looked up at their footsteps, her veiled face turning toward them with wary curiosity. "Mrs. Hayes," Elizabeth began gently, "my name is Elizabeth Rowden. This is Winston Harlow. We were associates of your husband." The woman stiffened. "I don't recall Redmond mentioning either of you." "We knew him long ago," Winston said. "Before Denver." Something in his tone made the widow study him more carefully. After a moment, she dismissed the hovering minister with a quiet word and gestured for them to follow her to a nearby bench. "You're from Medicine Creek," she said once they were seated, her voice barely audible. "He had nightmares about that place until the day he died." Winston and Elizabeth exchanged surprised glances. "He told you?" Winston asked. Mrs. Hayes gave a bitter laugh. "Not willingly, only in his sleep when the dreams came, and at the end, when he knew they were coming for him." She fumbled in her reticule, withdrawing a small envelope. "The day before they killed him, he gave me this. Said if anyone ever came asking about Medicine Creek, I should give them this, and then forget I'd ever heard the name." She pressed the envelope into Elizabeth's hands. "Now I've fulfilled my obligation to my husband. Please don't contact me again." "Contact. I have a son to protect." With that she rose and walked briskly toward a waiting carriage, never looking back. Elizabeth turned the envelope over in her hands. It was unmarked except for a small symbol drawn in the corner, a stylized bird that might have been an eagle or a phoenix. "We should go," Winston said, scanning the cemetery with increasing unease. Brennan might still be watching. They retreated to a small hotel on the city's edges, paying cash for a room under false names. Only when the door was locked behind them did Elizabeth open Hayes's envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a brief message in a shaky hand. "To whoever comes seeking the truth. Wallace didn't just take gold from Medicine Creek. What he found there is far more valuable and far more dangerous. The White Phoenix Society has existed in shadow since before the war, controlling resources king-making in Washington. Medicine Creek was their masterpiece, the leverage they needed to control the nation's future. Find Fordham. He kept records. Last I heard, he was living as Brother James at St. Benedict's Monastery near Pueblo. Trust no one. They are everywhere. R.H." Below the message was a crude map showing the location of the monastery and a strange symbol that matched the one on the envelope. "The White Phoenix Society," Elizabeth whispered. "Have you ever heard of them?" Winston shook his head slowly. "But I've seen that symbol before. At Medicine Creek, some of the men who weren't regular army had it tattooed on their wrists." They stared at the message in silence, the implications settling between them like a physical weight. This was no longer just about a gold theft or a military cover-up. They had stumbled onto something far larger and more dangerous, a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power. A sudden pounding on their hotel room door shattered the moment. "Denver police, open up!" Winston moved instantly to the window, peering through the curtain. The street below was filled with uniformed officers and plainclothesmen who could only be Pinkertons. "Back door," he asked urgently. Elizabeth shook her head. "Fire escape. Through the window." The pounding intensified. "Last warning, open this door, or we're breaking it down." As the door began to splinter under a battering ram, Winston and Elizabeth slipped through the window onto the narrow metal landing of the fire escape. Below them, more officers were moving to surround the building. Up, Elizabeth decided already, climbing the iron ladder toward the roof. They reached the rooftop just as shouts from their room indicated the police had discovered their escape route. Winston scanned the urban landscape spread before them, a maze of rooftops, some connected, others separated by daunting gaps. "This way," he said, taking Elizabeth's hand and pulling her toward the west side of the building. Behind them, the first officers emerged onto the fire escape, shouting for them to surrender. Ahead lay a treacherous path across Denver's rooftops with no guarantee of escape. And beyond that, if they somehow evaded capture, waited a monastery where a man named Fordham might hold the final pieces of a puzzle that had already cost too many lives. Winston and Elizabeth ran, their footsteps echoing across the slate roof as gunfire erupted behind them. They had entered the heart of Wallace's power and stirred a hornet's nest of secrets long buried. Now, they were fugitives not just from a corrupt general, but from what appeared to be a shadow organization with tentacles reaching into the very institutions meant to uphold justice. The White Phoenix Society had noticed them, and like Hayes, they were now marked for elimination. Rooftops blurred beneath their feet as Winston and Elizabeth raced across Denver's skyline, each leap between buildings a gamble with gravity. Behind them, police whistles pierced the afternoon air, accompanied by the occasional crack of gunfire that spurred them to greater speed. Winston's damaged leg threatened to betray him with every landing, but adrenaline dulled the pain to a distant throb. Elizabeth moved with surprising agility, her practical clothing allowing freedom of movement that would have been impossible in traditional feminine attire. There, Winston pointed to a church steeple rising above the surrounding buildings. "We can use the bell tower to descend." They reached the edge of the current rooftop, facing a gap of nearly 6 feet to the next building. Below, a narrow alley dropped 30 feet to cobblestones that promised death or crippling injury to anyone who fell. "I'll go first," Winston said, backing up several paces to gain momentum. He sprinted forward and launched himself across the void, landing heavily on the opposite roof and rolling to absorb the impact. Pain lanced through his leg, but he ignored it, turning to watch Elizabeth prepare for the jump. She backed up as he had done, face set in determination. As she began her run, a shout from behind made her glance back. That momentary distraction was enough. Her foot slipped at the edge, and though she cleared the gap, her landing was off balance. She tumbled dangerously close to the roof's edge, scrabbling for purchase on the slate tiles. Winston lunged forward, catching her wrist just as she began to slide over the edge. For a terrible moment, he felt her weight pulling them both toward the abyss. Then his boots found traction, and with a surge of desperate strength, he hauled her back onto the roof. They lay there for a moment, breathing hard, the gravity of their near disaster settling between them. "Thank you," Elizabeth gasped. Winston nodded, already scanning for their pursuers. "They're regrouping at street level. We need to keep moving." They reached the church without further incident, descending via the bell tower's interior staircase. The sanctuary below was empty, save for an elderly priest lighting candles at the altar. He glanced up in surprise as they emerged from the tower doorway. "Father," Winston said with a respectful nod, "forgive our unconventional entrance. We seek sanctuary." The priest's rheumy eyes took in their disheveled appearance and the intensity in their faces. "The Lord's house is open to all who come in peace," he said cautiously. "We mean no disrespect," Elizabeth added. "But men are pursuing us who would deny us justice." The old man considered this, then gestured toward a small door near the confessional. "The vestry. Wait there. I'll see what I can do." They slipped into the small room as shouting voices approached the church's main entrance. Through the partially open door, They watched as a contingent of police and Pinkerton agents burst into the sanctuary, led by none other than Thomas Brennan himself. "Father Sullivan," Brennan said with forced politeness, "we're pursuing dangerous fugitives, a man and woman armed and desperate. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" The elderly priest continued lighting candles, his movements unhurried. "Many souls seek refuge in God's house, Mr. Brennan. I don't question their reasons." "This isn't a matter for philosophical debate," Brennan snapped. "These people are wanted for murder. Murder!" The priest turned genuine surprise in his voice. "Whose murder?" "Captain Winston Harlow is wanted for the murder of his father, Rufford Harlow. The woman Elizabeth Rowden is his accomplice." Winston's hand tightened on the grip of his pistol, but Elizabeth placed a restraining touch on his arm, her expression pleading for patience. "I see," Father Sullivan said mildly. "And you have proof of these accusations?" Brennan's face flushed with anger. "We don't need to prove anything to you. By law, you must cooperate with officers of the court in apprehending fugitives." "Indeed," the priest nodded thoughtfully. "And I shall. But you must understand, Mr. Brennan, that I've been lighting these candles for nearly an hour. In that time, no one has entered this church except yourselves." He smiled benignly. "Perhaps your fugitives sought shelter elsewhere." Brennan studied the old man's face clearly, weighing whether to force the issue. Finally, he signaled to his men. "Search the surrounding streets. They can't have gone far." The group departed, Brennan lingering to deliver a final warning. "If I discover you've lied to protect them, Father, not even your collar will save you from charges of aiding fugitives." "I am accountable to a higher authority than the Denver police, Mr. Brennan," the priest replied serenely. "As are we all." When the church doors closed behind the search party, Father Sullivan approached the vestry. "They'll be back with a warrant," he said without preamble. "I can give you perhaps an hour's head start." "Why are you helping us?" Winston asked. The priest's gaze was keen despite his advanced age. "Because Thomas Brennan is a man who believes the end justifies the means. I've heard his confession. I know his soul." He crossed himself reflexively. "And because I knew Redmond Hayes. He came to me the day before his death, tortured by secrets he could no longer bear." Elizabeth stepped forward. "What did he tell you?" "That's between him and God now," Father Sullivan replied. "But he did leave something in my keeping." He moved to a small cabinet, unlocking it with a key from around his neck. From inside he retrieved a leather pouch. He said someone might come asking about Medicine Creek, and that I should give them this. Winston accepted the pouch, its weight suggesting papers or a small book inside. "There's a tunnel beneath the church," the priest continued. "Built during more dangerous times. It leads to a stable 2 blocks south. The owner, Michael Delaney, is a good Catholic who will ask no questions if you mention my name." "We're in your debt, Father," Elizabeth said. The old man shook his head. "Seek justice, but remember that vengeance belongs to the Lord alone." His gaze settled on Winston. "The line between the two is thinner than most realize." The tunnel was damp and low-ceilinged, forcing them to hunch as they made their way through the darkness by the light of a small lantern provided by Father Sullivan. It emerged as promised in the root cellar of a modest stable where a burly man with an Irish accent supplied them with fresh horses and directions to the South Road without comment. Only when they were miles outside Denver, hidden in a stand of pines as twilight settled over the land, did Winston finally open Hayes's leather pouch. Inside was a small journal bound in faded red leather, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. A quick examination revealed names, dates, and financial transactions spanning more than a decade, all connected to the White Phoenix Society. "My God," Elizabeth breathed as she scanned the entries. Hayes was keeping records of everything. Winston nodded grimly. Insurance. Smart man. They huddled close in the gathering darkness, reading by the light of a carefully shielded lantern. The journal detailed a conspiracy more extensive than either had imagined. The White Phoenix Society was no mere criminal enterprise, but a shadow cabinet of wealthy industrialists, politicians, and military leaders with a singular vision to reshape America through control of its expanding frontier. "Listen to this," Elizabeth said, pointing to an entry from 1868. "Medicine Creek operation approved. Wallace to command. Estimated yield 10,000 troy ounces minimum. Society investment $50,000 for equipment and personnel. Projected return $200,000 plus strategic positioning for Phase 2. Phase 2. Winston frowned. Elizabeth flipped forward several pages. Here, Phase 2 initiated June 1870. Denver Millbrook Spur Line survey completed. Land acquisition proceeding as planned. Hayes oversees financing through Denver Mercantile. Wallace manages regional security and political considerations. "They've been planning this for years," Winston murmured, "using the gold from Medicine Creek to buy land ahead of the railroad's expansion." "It's more than that," Elizabeth said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she turned to the journal's final entries. Hayes's last entry dated 3 days before his death. W. confirms presidential ambitions for 1880. Society backing assured with completion of transcontinental control. Medicine. Creek gold reserves positioned to manipulate national banking crisis when needed. God forgive me for my part in this. The implications settled between them like a physical weight. Wallace wasn't merely a corrupt officer who had massacred innocents for gold. He was part of a cabal planning to leverage control of Western resources into national political power with the presidency as the ultimate goal. "We need to get to Fordham," Winston said after a long silence. If Hayes was keeping records, Fordham might have documentation of the actual massacre. Elizabeth nodded carefully, returning the journal to its pouch. "The monastery is about 2 days' ride south, assuming we avoid main roads." "And assuming Fordham is still alive," Winston added grimly. They made camp for the night in a sheltered ravine, taking turns standing watch. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset, a reminder that winter still held Colorado in its grip despite the approach of spring. They huddled near a small, carefully shielded fire, speaking in low voices as they planned their next moves. "If Hayes is right about this White Phoenix Society," Winston said, "then we're facing something far more dangerous than just Wallace. We need proof that will stand up in court," Elizabeth replied. "Hayes's journal is a start, but it's one man's word. We need corroboration." Winston stared into the flames, his expression hardening. "8 years ago, I ran because I thought I was preserving my life. Now I wonder if I wasn't just preserving their secret." Elizabeth studied him across the fire, the flickering light casting his scarred face in stark relief. "You couldn't have known." "I should have tried harder to expose the truth," he insisted. "Instead, I hid in the mountains while Wallace built his empire on the bodies of my men and your sister." "Self-recrimination won't help us now," Elizabeth said firmly. "We need to focus on what we can still do." Winston nodded, though the guilt remained etched in the lines of his face. "You should rest," he said. "I'll take first watch." Elizabeth hesitated, then retrieved something from her saddlebag, a small sketchbook and pencil. "Do you mind?" she asked. "Drawing helps me think." Winston shrugged. "Suit yourself." She settled against a fallen log sketchbook balanced on her knees. For several minutes, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft scratching of pencil against paper. Winston cleaned his pistol methodically, a ritual that had become second nature during his years in the cavalry. "Why did you become a soldier?" Elizabeth asked suddenly, her pencil never pausing in its movement across the page. Winston's hands stilled on the disassembled weapon. "To spite my father initially," he admitted. "Rufford was Confederate to his bones. When I enlisted with the Union, he said I was dead to him. And after that, why stay in the army after the war?" Winston reassembled the pistol with practiced efficiency. "Because I was good at it. Because I believed in bringing order to chaos." A bitter smile crossed his face, ironic considering how it ended. Elizabeth nodded, continuing to sketch. "My father wanted me to be a teacher or a governess, something respectable. When I showed talent for art, he called it a frivolous distraction. Yet you pursued it anyway." "Art reveals truth," she said simply, "even when people don't want to see it. Especially then." Winston glanced at her sketchbook. "What truth are you revealing now?" Instead of answering, Elizabeth turned the sketchbook toward him. On the page was a striking portrait of Winston himself, not as he appeared now, but as he might have looked before Medicine Creek. The face she had drawn was younger, unmarred by the scar eyes, clear of the haunted look he now carried. Yet it was unmistakably him captured with an insight that was almost unnerving. "How?" he began. "I told you I make it my business to know faces," she replied. "I studied photographs of you at Wallace's house. He keeps a collection of all the officers who served under him. This is how you looked before." Winston stared at the portrait, confronted with a ghost of his former self. "You're very talented." "It's not talent so much as observation," Elizabeth said, taking back the sketchbook. "People reveal themselves in 1,000 small ways. The artist merely needs to pay attention." "And what do you see when you look at me now?" Winston asked, unsure why the question felt so important. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. "A man trying to reclaim something he lost," she finally said. "Not just his name or his honor, but his belief that justice is possible." And the perceptiveness of her assessment left Winston momentarily speechless. He had spent 8 years avoiding mirrors, uncomfortable with the stranger who looked back at him. Yet in a few strokes of pencil, this woman had captured not just his appearance, but the essence of his struggle. "Get some rest," he said gruffly, turning away to conceal the emotion her insight had stirred. "We have a long ride tomorrow." Elizabeth didn't press the issue, sensing his discomfort. She tucked the sketchbook away and wrapped herself in a blanket near the fire. Soon, her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep, leaving Winston alone with his thoughts and the vast Colorado night. He watched her in the dying firelight, this strange, determined woman who had inserted herself into his fight for reasons both professional and deeply personal. In another life, under different circumstances, he might have Winston cut the thought short, refocusing on their predicament. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not with Wallace's men surely combing every road between Denver and the territorial border. They needed to reach Fordham before their enemies realized their destination. As if summoned by his thoughts, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their camp. Winston froze, hand moving silently to his pistol. There another sound too deliberate for wildlife. Someone was approaching their position with practiced stealth. Winston extinguished the last embers of their fire with a handful of dirt, plunging the camp into darkness. Moving silently to Elizabeth's side, he covered her mouth with his hand, waking her without sound. Her eyes flew open, instantly alert. He pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed to the darkness beyond their camp. Elizabeth nodded her understanding, reaching for her own weapon. They crouched in the shadows, listening as footsteps circled their position, multiple sets moving with military precision. A voice called from the darkness startlingly close. "We know you're there, Harlow. No sense in making this harder than it needs to be." Winston recognized the voice with a jolt of surprise. It belonged to Major Samuel Crawford, once his second-in-command at Fort Laramie, and one of the men who had testified against him after Medicine Creek. "Crawford," he called back. "Still doing Wallace's dirty work, I see." A chuckle floated through the darkness. "And you're still a stubborn fool. 8 years in hiding wasn't enough for you. Had to come back and stir up old ghosts." "Those ghosts never rested," Winston replied, trying to pinpoint Crawford's position by his voice. "Neither will I, until the truth about Medicine Creek is known." "Truth?" Crawford sounded genuinely amused. "You wouldn't recognize the truth if it shot you between the eyes. Which incidentally is exactly what's about to happen unless you and the woman surrender now." Winston caught Elizabeth's eye, gesturing toward a rocky outcropping that might provide cover for their escape. She nodded, understanding his intent without words. "How many men have you brought, Crawford?" Winston called, hoping to keep the major talking while they prepared to move. "Must take a lot of guns to make you feel safe from one man you already left for dead." "Enough men to ensure you stay dead this time," Crawford replied. "Wallace was quite specific about that. No loose ends." As Crawford spoke, Winston detected movement to their right, a shadow detaching from the deeper darkness, moving to flank their position. He aimed carefully and fired twice. A cry of pain confirmed his accuracy. Chaos erupted as Crawford's men opened fire bullets, thudding into trees and ricocheting off rocks around their position. Winston grabbed Elizabeth's arm, and together they sprinted toward the outcropping, staying low as gunfire tracked their movement. They reached the rocks just as a bullet tore through Winston's coat sleeve, missing flesh by inches. Pressed against the cold stone, they returned fire sparingly, more to keep their attackers at bay than with any real hope of hitting targets in the darkness. "We're pinned down," Elizabeth said, her voice remarkably steady despite the danger. "They'll surround us by dawn." Winston nodded grimly. The rocky outcropping provided temporary shelter, but Crawford's men could easily wait them out or bring in reinforcements. They needed an escape route, and quickly. His gaze fell on their horses, tethered at the edge of the camp. If they could reach them— "Cover me," he said, checking the loads in his pistol. "I'm going for the horses." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "That's suicide. We're dead anyway if we stay here. At least this way, one of us might get out with Hayes's journal." Before she could protest further, Winston gathered himself for the dash across open ground. As he tensed to move, a new sound cut through the night, a high, ululating cry that echoed off the ravine walls. It was answered by similar cries from different directions, creating a disorienting chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Crawford's men ceased firing their confused shouts, suggesting they were as startled by the new development as Winston and Elizabeth. "What is that?" Elizabeth whispered. Winston shook his head, equally baffled. "Not cavalry signals. Almost sounds like—" His answer was cut short by a new eruption of gunfire, not directed at their position this time, but at Crawford's men. Muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness, accompanied by more of those eerie cries and the thunder of approaching horses. "Cheyenne!" Winston breathed, recognition dawning. "Those are Cheyenne war cries." The night dissolved into chaotic combat, as mounted warriors swept through Crawford's position with devastating effect. Winston and Elizabeth watched in stunned silence as their pursuers were overwhelmed by the surprise attack, Crawford's shouts for order drowned out by the sounds of battle. Within minutes, it was over. An unnatural silence fell over the ravine, broken only by the occasional groan of a wounded man and the soft nickering of horses. "What now?" Elizabeth whispered. "We wait." Winston replied. "See who comes looking for us." They didn't have to wait long. A figure approached their hiding place, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. As it drew nearer, Winston made out details: a young Cheyenne warrior, perhaps 25, wearing a mixture of traditional dress and cavalry-issue clothing. Most strikingly, he wore an army officer's kepi cap, adorned with eagle feathers. The warrior stopped several yards from their position. "Captain Harlow," he called in perfect, unaccented English, "you can come out. Major Crawford and his men won't trouble you further." Winston exchanged a glance with Elizabeth, then slowly rose from behind the rocks, pistol still at the ready. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" The young warrior smiled, the expression visible even in the dim light. "I am Gray Shield, son of Standing Bear of the Northern Cheyenne, and I know your name because 8 years ago you saved my life at Medicine Creek." Winston stared at the warrior, memories flooding back of a terrified boy he had hidden beneath the bodies of the dead to protect him from Wallace's men. You were just a child." "Children grow," Gray Shield replied, "and they remember those who showed them kindness in dark times." He gestured toward the east, where the first hint of dawn was lightening the sky. "Come, we have a camp nearby. It isn't safe to remain here." Elizabeth emerged from their shelter, regarding the warrior with cautious curiosity. "Why did you help us?" Gray Shield's expression grew serious. "Because the spirits told us Captain Harlow had returned from the dead to bring justice for our people. And because General Wallace is as much our enemy as he is yours." He turned and whistled softly. 2 more warriors appeared, leading Winston and Elizabeth's horses, already saddled. "My father wishes to speak with you," Gray Shield continued. "He has waited many years for this day." Winston hesitated, decades of frontier experience making him wary of such providential rescue. "Crawford's men, those who survived, have fled," Gray Shield assured him. "We took no scalps, though some of my brothers argued for it." A grim smile crossed his face. "We are civilized now, or so the government tells us." The irony in his voice was unmistakable. With few alternatives, Winston and Elizabeth mounted their horses and followed Gray Shield and his warriors into the mountains as dawn broke over the Colorado landscape. Behind them lay the scattered remnants of Crawford's ambush party, a warning to Wallace that his prey now had unexpected allies. The Cheyenne camp was hidden in a sheltered valley that showed no signs of habitation when viewed from the surrounding ridges, a necessary precaution for a people who had learned that visibility often meant vulnerability. It was a small settlement, perhaps 20 lodges arranged in the traditional circle, with horses picketed nearby and cook fires sending thin columns of smoke into the morning air. As they rode into camp, Winston was struck by the mixture of traditional and modern elements. Women worked at tanning hides and preparing food using both ancient methods and tools clearly obtained from white settlements. Children played among the lodges, some dressed in buckskins, others in cast-off clothing from frontier towns. They were led to the largest lodge at the center of the camp. Gray Shield dismounted and gestured for them to do the same. "My father awaits you," he said, holding aside the lodge entrance. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with burning sage. An elderly man sat beside a small central fire, his face deeply lined with age and experience, his long gray hair adorned with a single eagle feather. Despite his years, he sat straight-backed, dignity emanating from him like heat from the fire. "Standing Bear," Gray Shield said respectfully, "I have brought the one called Winston Harlow and his companion." The old man studied them silently for a long moment, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally he spoke in the same fluent English as his son. "8 winters have passed since Medicine Creek. he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of leadership. 8 winters of waiting for justice that never came. Now the dead man returns, and with him, perhaps the truth. Winston knelt respectfully across the fire from the Cheyenne leader. "I have come seeking the same justice, Chief Standing Bear." The old man nodded, as if Winston had confirmed something he already knew. The white man's justice is a strange thing, sometimes present, often absent, rarely complete. What form of justice do you seek, Winston Harlow? "The truth to be known," Winston replied. "Those responsible to be held accountable." "And the woman," Standing Bear turned his penetrating gaze to Elizabeth. "What justice does she seek?" Elizabeth knelt beside Winston. "My sister was killed for learning the truth about Medicine Creek. I seek to honor her memory by finishing what she started." Standing Bear considered this, then gestured for them to sit more comfortably. "Gray Shield tells me you are hunted by Wallace's men. This is not surprising. The one you call General has many eyes and many guns at his command." "You know Wallace?" Winston asked. A shadow passed over the chief's weathered features. "I know him as I know the winter storm by the destruction he leaves behind. Medicine Creek was not his first crime against my people, nor his last." Gray Shield, who had been standing silently at the lodge entrance, spoke up. "Father, tell them about the prophecy." Standing Bear shot his son a reproving glance, but then sighed in acquiescence. "My son believes too strongly in visions," he said to Winston and Elizabeth. "But it is true that our medicine man foretold the return of a dead soldier who would help bring justice for Medicine Creek." "I don't put much stock in prophecies," Winston said carefully. "Nor do I," Standing Bear agreed, surprising them. "I put my faith in actions, not words or visions. And your actions at Medicine Creek spoke clearly of the man you are." He leaned forward, the firelight deepening the lines in his face. "You tried to stop the killing. When you could not, you saved my son and several others by hiding them among the dead." Winston's expression darkened with the memory. "I didn't save enough." "No man can save everyone," Standing Bear said. "The question is whether you did what you could with what you had." He studied Winston intently. "I believe you did. This is why we will help you now." Elizabeth glanced between the two men. "How can you help us?" "By showing you what Wallace truly seeks at Medicine Creek," the chief replied. "It was never about gold alone." Winston frowned. "What do you mean?" Standing Bear rose with the deliberate movements of age and retrieved a small wooden box from a shadowed corner of the lodge. From it, he withdrew an object wrapped in soft buckskin. "Before the soldiers came," he explained, "Medicine Creek was sacred to my people because of what lies beneath it." He unwrapped the buckskin, revealing a chunk of dark rock streaked with metallic veins. "The white man calls it uranium. My people called it the stone that burns." Elizabeth leaned closer, examining the rock with professional interest. "I've heard of this. It's used in some photographic processes and glass-making. And it is used for many things," Standing Bear agreed. But Wallace's scientists believed it held greater power. They spoke of weapons that could destroy entire cities. Winston exchanged a skeptical glance with Elizabeth. "That sounds far-fetched." "Perhaps," the chief acknowledged, "but they believed it strongly enough to kill for it. The gold was valuable, yes, but this," he rewrapped the stone carefully, "this was their true objective." The lodge fell silent as Winston and Elizabeth absorbed this new information. If true, it added yet another dimension to Wallace's crimes and potentially raise the stakes of their quest for justice even higher. "We're trying to reach a man named Fordham," Winston said finally. "He may have records that could expose Wallace's actions." Standing Bear nodded thoughtfully. "The monastery near Pueblo. We know of this place." He turned to his son. "Gray Shield will guide you there by paths Wallace's men do not know." "Why are you helping us?" Elizabeth asked. The old chief's eyes met hers directly. "Because 8 winters is too long for the dead of Medicine Creek to wait for justice. Because Wallace and his White Phoenix Society threaten not just my people, but all people who stand in their path." His gaze shifted to Winston. "And because a debt of life must be repaid." Gray Shield stepped forward. "We should leave at nightfall. Wallace's men will be watching the main roads, but I know ways through the mountains that only the Cheyenne remember." Standing Bear rose, signaling the end of the council. "Rest now. Eat. Gather your strength. The journey ahead will test you in ways you cannot foresee." As they prepared to leave the lodge, the chief placed a weathered hand on Winston's shoulder. "Remember, white soldier, the dead of Medicine Creek watch your path. Their spirits will not rest until truth walks in the sunlight once more." The weight of those words followed Winston as he stepped back into the mountain sunshine where the Cheyenne camp continued its daily routines around them. Elizabeth moved to his side, her expression troubled. "Uranium," she murmured. Could Wallace truly believe it could be weaponized? "Men have sought the power to destroy cities since the beginning of warfare," Winston replied. "Whether it's possible or not, the belief alone would be enough to drive men like Wallace." Gray Shield approached, interrupting their conversation. "Come, you should eat and rest. Tonight's journey will be long." As they followed him through the camp, Winston felt the weight of eyes upon them, not hostile, but measuring, as if the entire tribe was assessing whether these 2 outsiders were worthy of the chief's trust and the risk of their protection. For the first time since receiving Clement's letter, Winston felt the true scope of what they had undertaken. This was no longer merely about clearing his name or avenging fallen comrades. They had stumbled into a conspiracy that stretched from the blood-soaked ground of Medicine Creek to the highest corridors of power in Washington, a conspiracy willing to massacre innocents for resources that might reshape the balance of global power. And somewhere in a monastery near Pueblo, a man named Fordham might hold the key to exposing it all if they could reach him before Wallace's men silenced him forever. As the day wore on, Winston and Elizabeth prepared for the journey ahead, checking weapons and supplies, while Gray Shield consulted with other warriors about their route. The camp maintained a vigilant watch on the surrounding mountains, scouts positioned to provide early warning of any approach. Evening approached with the promise of another cold night, the setting sun painting the western sky in shades of crimson that reminded Winston too vividly of blood on snow. As darkness fell, Gray Shield returned to where they waited beside their saddled horses. "It is time," he said simply. They mounted up, following Gray Shield and 2 other warriors out of the protected valley and into the wild country beyond. Behind them, the Cheyenne camp disappeared into the landscape as if it had never existed. A ghost village of a people fighting to survive in a world that increasingly had no place for them. Ahead lay Pueblo and the monastery where Fordham might be hiding a man who had once been Wallace's trusted aide before fleeing the horror of Medicine Creek. Whether he would welcome their arrival or fear it remained to be seen. As they rode into the gathering darkness, Winston could almost feel the weight of Standing Bear's words pressing upon him. The dead of Medicine Creek were watching. Waiting for justice long delayed. He had run from that responsibility once before, seeking safety in anonymity. This time, he would see it through whatever the cost. They traveled only by night, moving through mountain passes and hidden valleys known exclusively to the Cheyenne. Gray Shield led them with an unerring sense of direction, navigating terrain that would have been impassable to most white men. By day, they sheltered in caves or dense forest groves, carefully concealing all signs of their presence. The journey to Pueblo would normally take 2 days by main roads. Their circuitous route through the wilderness stretched it to 4 each night, bringing them closer to their destination, while further testing their endurance. Winston found himself impressed by Elizabeth's resilience. She rode without complaint despite the punishing pace and harsh conditions. At their daytime camps, she would often sketch in her small book, capturing Gray Shield's proud profile or the stark beauty of the Colorado wilderness with swift, sure strokes. On the 4th night, they crested a ridge to see the lights of Pueblo glimmering in the valley below. The town had grown considerably since Winston had last passed through the railroad's influence, evident in the sprawl of new construction around the depot. "St. Benedict's is there," Gray Shield said, pointing to a cluster of stone buildings set apart from the town proper, their silhouettes just visible in the moonlight. Built on land that was once Cheyenne hunting ground. There was no bitterness in his voice, merely a statement of historical fact. "Wallace's men will be watching it," Winston observed. "If they've anticipated our destination." Gray Shield nodded. "2 riders have been posted on the road since yesterday. More arrived this morning." Elizabeth looked sharply at the young warrior. "How do you know this?" "Because my brothers have been watching the monastery since we left our camp," Gray Shield replied with a slight smile. "We may be few now, but we still know how to move unseen through our own lands." "Is there another way in?" Winston asked. "The monks maintain a garden at the rear of the compound. The wall there is lower, hidden from the main road by an orchard." Gray Shield's expression grew serious. "But I cannot take you further. My presence would only draw attention." Winston understood. A Cheyenne warrior near a white settlement would be immediately noticed, potentially endangering both their mission and Gray Shield's people. "You've done more than enough," Winston assured him. "We can make our way from here." Gray Shield dismounted the other 2 warriors following suit. From his saddlebag he retrieved a small leather pouch, which he presented to Winston. "Medicine," he explained, "for pain and for strength. You may need both before your journey ends." Winston accepted the gift with solemn respect. "Thank you, Gray Shield, for everything." The young warrior clasped Winston's forearm in the white man's gesture of friendship. "Find your truth, Captain Harlow. My father believes it is bound to our own." And Elizabeth Gray Shield offered a small carving of an eagle crafted from antler bone. "For courage," he said. "Though I think you have enough already." Elizabeth tucked the token into her coat. "Tell your father we won't forget his help." With a final nod, Gray Shield and his companions melted back into the darkness, leaving Winston and Elizabeth alone on the ridge overlooking Pueblo. Below them lay their destination, and quite possibly, a trap. "How do you want to approach this?" Elizabeth asked. Winston studied the layout of the monastery through his field glasses. "We'll wait until full dark, then circle around to the garden Gray Shield mentioned. Better to arrive unannounced." They tethered their horses in a sheltered grove and proceeded on foot, using the cover of night and terrain to approach the monastery from its least guarded side. The journey took nearly 2 hours of careful movement, staying off roads and avoiding isolated homesteads, where dogs might announce their presence. The monastery wall, when they reached it, was indeed lower at the garden side, about 8 feet of rough-hewn stone, topped with decorative rather than defensive capping. They waited in the shadows of the orchard, watching for any sign of guards or monks. "Seems quiet," Elizabeth whispered. Too quiet, Winston thought, but didn't say. The entire compound had a stillness that felt unnatural, as if holding its breath. Only a few windows showed lamplight despite the relatively early hour. "I'll go over first," he said, approaching the wall. "Wait for my signal." Using handholds in the weathered stone, Winston scaled the wall with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to military operations. At the top, he paused, surveying the garden beyond. Rows of early spring vegetables stretched before him, bordered by herb beds and fruit trees just beginning to bud. A stone path led to a small door in the main building. Seeing no immediate threat, Winston dropped silently to the ground inside and signaled for Elizabeth to follow. She climbed with surprising agility, though he still reached up to help her down from the top. They crossed the garden quickly, keeping to shadows. The monastery door was unlocked, common in such communities, where trust and openness were foundational values. It opened silently on well-oiled hinges, admitting them to a dimly lit corridor that smelled of beeswax, candles, and incense. "We need to find the abbot, or someone who can direct us to Fordham," Winston murmured. "Or Brother James, as he's known here." They moved cautiously through the silent hallways, encountering no one. The stillness that had seemed odd from outside now felt positively eerie within. A monastery should have some activity, even at night. Monks rising for midnight prayers, moving through corridors, with candles, the distant sound of chanting. Instead, there was nothing but their own quiet footsteps and the occasional creak of the old building settling. They reached what appeared to be the main chapel, a modest space, with simple wooden pews facing an altar adorned only with a cross and 2 candlesticks. The candles were lit, but burned low, suggesting they had been left unattended for some time. "Something's wrong," Elizabeth whispered, voicing what they both felt. Winston nodded grimly. "Stay close." They continued their exploration, finding a refectory with tables set for a meal that had never been eaten, and a kitchen with food partially prepared, then abandoned. It was as if the entire monastery had been suddenly evacuated, or worse. A narrow staircase led them to the 2nd floor, where individual cells lined a long corridor. Each door stood partially open, revealing Spartan rooms with single beds, most undisturbed. The sense of wrongness intensified with each empty room they passed. At the end of the corridor, they found a slightly larger cell that appeared to serve as the abbot's quarters. Unlike the others, this room showed signs of disturbance: drawers pulled open, papers scattered across a simple desk, a chair overturned. Elizabeth examined the papers while Winston checked the adjoining rooms. "These are administrative records," she reported. "Nothing that mentions Fordham or Brother James." Winston returned his expression grim. "No sign of anyone dead or alive, but there's blood on the floor in the next room. Not much, but recent." A soft sound from the corridor froze them both. Winston drew his pistol, motioning for Elizabeth to stay behind him as he approached the door. The sound came again, a faint shuffling like something being dragged across the floor. Moving silently to the doorway, Winston peered into the corridor. A dark figure was moving slowly toward the staircase, hunched and unsteady. As Winston watched, the figure stumbled against the wall, one hand leaving a smeared blood stain on the whitewashed surface. "Who's there?" Winston called his pistol, trained on the shadowy form. The figure jerked in surprise, then turned. In the dim light filtering through a window, Winston could make out the face of an elderly man in monk's robes, blood staining one side of his habit. "Please," the monk gasped, his voice barely audible. "They may still be here." Winston moved quickly to the old man's side, supporting him as his legs began to give way. Elizabeth joined them, helping to ease the injured monk to the floor. "What happened here?" Winston asked. "Where is everyone?" The monk's eyes were glassy with pain and blood loss. "They came at dusk, men with guns, looking for Brother James." He coughed weakly, said they were federal marshals, but they wore no badges. Wallace's men, Elizabeth murmured, examining the monk's wound, a bullet hole in his side that had been crudely bandaged. Where are the other monks? Winston pressed. Chapel cellar, the old man whispered. Locked in. I was searching for help when they shot me. Pretended to be dead until they left. And Brother James? Elizabeth asked. Did they find him? The monk's eyes focused on her face, as if truly seeing her for the first time. You seek him too. Why, to help him, Winston assured the man. He has information about a massacre that happened years ago, evidence that could bring the responsible parties to justice. The monk studied them for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust these strangers. Finally, he nodded weakly. Not Brother James. Not anymore. Returned to his birth name when he left us 3 months ago. Winston and Elizabeth exchanged alarmed glances. Left? Where did he go? Denver first, then said he was heading to Washington with evidence of some great crime. The monk's breathing grew more labored. Seemed frightened, paranoid. Said if anything happened to him, we should direct inquiries to his lawyer in Denver. Prescott. Something. Prescott Hamilton. Elizabeth suggested, recognition flashing in her eyes. The monk nodded feebly. Yes, that's the name. We need to get you help, Winston said, noting the spreading blood stain on the monk's robe. And free the others. Too late for me, the old man whispered. Key to cellar, in my pocket. Go before they come back. Elizabeth searched the monk's robe, finding a large iron key. We can't just leave him, she said to Winston. You must, the monk insisted. They said they would return by dawn to make sure. No witnesses. His hand clutched at Winston's sleeve with surprising strength. Are you the one Brother James spoke of? The dead soldier who would return? Winston frowned. I was a soldier. People thought I was dead. A smile ghosted across the dying man's face. Then, it is as he said. His eyes drifted past them, focusing on something only he could see. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. The hand on Winston's sleeve went slack, the monk's final prayer fading into silence. Elizabeth gently closed the unseeing eyes, crossing herself reflexively despite her Protestant upbringing. We need to free the others and get out of here, Winston said, rising. If Wallace's men are coming back at dawn, we have maybe 3 hours. They found the chapel cellar easily enough, a heavy wooden door secured with an iron lock that the key opened with a protesting squeal of metal. Inside, 20 monks huddled in darkness, their faces registering shock and fear as Winston and Elizabeth appeared. Father Benedict is dead, Winston informed them without preamble. The men who did this are returning at dawn. You need to evacuate now. The senior monk among them, a tall man with a scholar's stoop, stepped forward. Who are you? Why should we trust you? Because we're not holding guns, Elizabeth replied practically. And we just unlocked your door. This simple logic seemed to convince the monks who filed out of the cellar with murmured prayers for their fallen abbot. The senior monk, who introduced himself as Brother Thomas, led them to a side chapel where they laid Father Benedict's body. He was a good man, Brother Thomas said as they covered the abbot with a simple shroud. He had no part in Brother James's past, yet he died for it all the same. What did Fordham tell you about his past? Winston asked. Brother Thomas shook his head. Very little. Only that he had witnessed a great crime committed by powerful men, and that someday someone might come seeking the truth. He studied Winston with shrewd eyes. I assume that someone is you. Yes, Winston acknowledged, though it seems we're too late. Perhaps not entirely. Brother Thomas moved to a panel in the chapel wall, pressing a hidden mechanism that caused it to swing outward, revealing a small hidden compartment. From inside, he withdrew a leather portfolio. Brother James, or James Fordham, as you call him, left this in my keeping. He said, if anyone came asking specific questions about Medicine Creek, I should give them this. Winston accepted the portfolio with careful hands. Did you look inside? It was not my place, Brother Thomas replied. Brother James said it contained both salvation and damnation. I took that to mean it was best left unopened by those not directly concerned. The portfolio was sealed with wax, stamped with the insignia Winston now recognized as belonging to the White Phoenix Society, a phoenix rising from flames, wings outstretched. Thank you, Winston said, tucking the portfolio securely inside his coat. Now you should all leave quickly. These men won't hesitate to kill everyone here to keep their secrets. Brother Thomas nodded gravely. We have a retreat in the mountains, where we can shelter until it's safe to return. He hesitated, then added, whatever Brother James witnessed clearly haunted him until the day he left us. I pray you find the justice he sought. With the monks safely evacuated, Winston and Elizabeth returned to the abbot's office to examine Fordham's portfolio in private. The wax seal broke with a satisfying crack, revealing a collection of documents, maps, and personal correspondence. My God, Elizabeth breathed as they spread the contents across the desk. He kept everything. Fordham had indeed been thorough. The portfolio contained official orders for the Medicine Creek operation signed by Wallace himself. Maps showing the location of both gold and uranium deposits, correspondence between Wallace and other members of the White Phoenix Society discussing the strategic necessity of removing the Cheyenne from lands containing valuable resources, and most damning of all, a detailed account of the massacre written in Fordham's own hand. This is everything we need, Winston said, scanning the documents. Names, dates, details that only a participant could know. Elizabeth was examining another document, a letter from Fordham to someone identified only as A.L. in Washington. He sent copies, she realized. Before he left the monastery, he sent duplicate evidence to someone in Washington. Which is why Wallace's men came here, Winston concluded. They're trying to track down all copies before they reach the right authorities. A yellowed newspaper clipping caught Elizabeth's attention. It was an obituary from the Washington Chronicle dated just 3 weeks earlier. Lincoln Anthony J., 52, Special Investigator for the Department of Interior, died suddenly at his home on March 12th. Officials cite natural causes. Mr. Lincoln was known for his uncompromising investigations into corruption in Western land dealings and Indian affairs. He is survived by his wife, Margaret, and 2 daughters. A.L., Elizabeth said softly. Anthony Lincoln. Wallace got to him first. Winston's expression hardened. But not before Lincoln received Fordham's evidence. It has to be somewhere in Washington, perhaps, with Lincoln's widow or colleagues. Which means we need to get these documents to Washington as well, Elizabeth said, before Wallace can silence everyone who might act on them. Winston nodded grimly. But first, we need to find Prescott Hamilton in Denver. If he was Fordham's lawyer, he might know where Fordham is now and what happened to the evidence he sent east. They carefully repacked the portfolio, securing it inside Winston's coat. As they prepared to leave the monastery, a distant sound froze them in place, the unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses. Wallace's men, Winston said, moving quickly to a window. In the pre-dawn light, he could make out a group of riders approaching from the direction of Pueblo. At least 8 of them coming up the main road. Earlier than expected, Elizabeth observed, gathering their few belongings. We need another way out. They hurried through the empty corridors, heading for the garden wall through which they had entered. As they passed the kitchen, Winston paused, an idea forming. "Wait," he said, gathering several bottles of cooking oil. "If they're coming to destroy evidence, we should give them something else to worry about." Working quickly, he spread oil across the wooden floors and furniture, creating a trail from the kitchen to the main entrance. Using a monk's discarded robe, he fashioned a makeshift torch. "Once we're over the wall, I'll light this," he explained. "The fire will draw their attention and hopefully destroy any traces of our presence." Elizabeth nodded her understanding, though her expression was troubled. "The monastery can be rebuilt," Winston finished. "The truth about Medicine Creek once lost might never be recovered." They slipped out through the garden door, just as the sounds of horses reached the monastery's front entrance. Winston lit the torch from a kitchen lantern and tossed it onto the oil-soaked path he had created. Flames leapt hungrily across the dry wood, spreading with alarming speed. By the time they reached the garden wall, shouts of alarm were already rising from the front of the monastery. Winston boosted Elizabeth to the top of the wall, then followed both, dropping into the orchard beyond as smoke began to billow from the monastery windows. "That won't hold them for long," Winston said as they raced through the orchard toward where they had left their horses. "We need to reach Denver before they realize what we've found." They retrieved their horses and set off northward, avoiding the main road in favor of less traveled paths through the foothills. Behind them, the sky glowed orange with the burning monastery, black smoke rising like an accusing finger against the lightning dawn. The journey to Denver was a brutal test of endurance. Aware that telegraph lines would carry news of the monastery fire and their description far faster than they could travel, Winston and Elizabeth avoided towns and roads, making their way through wilderness whenever possible. They reached the outskirts of Denver on the third day, exhausted and trail-worn. The city that had nearly proved their undoing days earlier now represented their best hope for finding Fordham and continuing their journey to Washington. "We can't just ride into the city," Elizabeth said as they watched Denver from a hillside overlooking the eastern approaches. "Wallace will have men watching every entrance." Winston nodded in agreement. We need help. Someone Wallace wouldn't suspect." Elizabeth considered for a moment. "Father Sullivan," she suggested. "The priest who helped us before. His church is on the western edge of the city. We could approach from the mountains instead of the main roads." "A church would be the first place they'd look for us now," Winston countered. "After the monastery." "Then we need someone with no connection to either of us," Elizabeth said. She hesitated, then added reluctantly, "I might know someone, a woman I met when I first arrived in Denver, Vivian Montgomery. She runs a photography studio downtown." "Can she be trusted?" "She's no friend of Wallace," Elizabeth replied. "Her husband was a reporter who died under suspicious circumstances after investigating corruption in railroad land deals." Winston weighed their limited options. "It's risky, but we have few alternatives. How do we contact her without exposing ourselves?" Elizabeth removed a small card from her pocket, a calling card with elegant script that read, "Montgomery Photographic Studio, 1227 Larimer Street, Denver." "She gave me this when I arrived, said to call on her if I needed anything." Elizabeth traced the embossed lettering with her finger. "I never did." "Until now," Winston finished. They formulated a plan that balanced caution with their urgent need to move forward. Using the last of their money, Elizabeth purchased suitable clothing from a farmhouse on the outskirts of town, transforming herself from trail-worn fugitive to respectable widow. Winston would remain hidden outside the city while she made contact with Vivian Montgomery. "I don't like this," Winston said as they prepared to separate. "You're taking all the risk." "I'm also less recognizable," Elizabeth pointed out. "Wallace's men are primarily looking for you, the dead officer, back from the grave. A widow seeking photographic remembrances of her late husband will hardly attract notice." Though he disliked the logic, Winston couldn't argue with it. They agreed on a rendezvous point and time, a small chapel in the hills west of Denver at sunset. "If I'm not there by full dark, don't wait," Elizabeth instructed. "Take the portfolio to Washington yourself." Winston shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving without you." Elizabeth met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "Just be there," she said softly. She rode toward Denver alone, her black dress and veil lending credibility to her widow's disguise. Winston watched until she disappeared from view, then retreated further into the hills to await nightfall. Fordham's portfolio, a constant weight against his chest. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. Winston cleaned his weapons, checked and rechecked their supplies, and studied the documents in Fordham's portfolio, committing key details to memory in case they were separated from the physical evidence. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, anxiety gnawed at him. Elizabeth had been gone too long. Something had gone wrong. He should never have let her go alone. When the appointed hour arrived with no sign of her, Winston faced an impossible choice: honor her instruction to continue to Washington without her, or risk everything to find her in a city crawling with Wallace's men. It was no choice at all. Darkness had fully claimed the land when Winston approached Denver from the west, using the cover of night and his knowledge of military patrols to slip past the city's watchful guardians. He had abandoned his horse in favor of stealth, moving on foot, through alleys and shadows, toward the address on Vivian Montgomery's card. Montgomery Photographic Studio occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building on Larimer Street, sandwiched between a bookshop and a milliner's establishment. A sign in the window indicated the business was closed, but a light burned in the rooms above. Winston circled the block twice, checking for surveillance before approaching the rear entrance. A narrow staircase led to a door that presumably connected to the living quarters above the studio. He climbed silently, every sense alert for danger. At the top, he paused, listening intently. Female voices filtered through the door, one that he recognized immediately as Elizabeth's, and another with the refined accent of an educated Eastern woman. They appeared to be alone. Winston knocked softly 3 measured taps that would identify him to Elizabeth. Silence fell inside, followed by the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of Elizabeth's face. "Winston," she breathed, relief evident in her voice as she pulled the door wider. "Thank God." He stepped inside quickly, finding himself in a comfortable apartment filled with photographs and artwork. A striking woman in her 30s rose from a settee, regarding him with curious intensity. Her copper hair was arranged in a practical yet elegant knot, and she wore a photographer's smock over a fashionable dress. "Mrs. Montgomery," Winston said with a respectful nod. "Mr. Harlow," she replied, her gaze assessing him with professional acuity. "Elizabeth has told me quite a story about you and General Wallace." "All of it true, I'm afraid." Vivian Montgomery's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "I never doubted that. Wallace is exactly the sort of man who would massacre a village for profit and call it patriotism." She gestured for him to sit. "Elizabeth tells me you need to find Prescott Hamilton." Winston took the offered chair, his body reminding him of days of hard riding and too little rest. "He was James Fordham's lawyer. We believe he may know Fordham's current whereabouts. And you need this information to get evidence of Wallace's crimes to Washington," Vivian finished, "before Wallace can silence everyone who knows the truth." "You seem well informed, Mrs." Montgomery. Vivian, please. She moved to a sideboard and poured 3 glasses of amber liquid. My husband, Robert, spent the last year of his life investigating connections between railroad companies and land appropriations in Colorado Territory. 3 days after he told me he had evidence of criminal conspiracy involving the highest levels of territorial government, he was found dead in an alley. Robbery, the police said. She handed glasses to Winston and Elizabeth, her steady gaze belying the bitterness in her voice. He had nothing worth stealing except the truth. Winston accepted the drink with a nod of understanding. I'm sorry about your husband. As am I. Vivian raised her glass slightly. To justice delayed, but not denied. They drank to the toast, the whiskey burning a fiery path down Winston's throat. Now, Vivian continued, about Prescott Hamilton. He's one of the few honest lawyers in Denver, which is why he's not particularly wealthy or influential. His office is on 17th Street, but he won't be there now. Where can we find him? Elizabeth asked. That's the complicated part, Vivian replied. Prescott left Denver 3 days ago after his office was ransacked. He sent me a message saying he was heading to his cabin in the mountains until certain matters cooled down. Winston's expression darkened. Wallace got to him too. Tried to, Vivian corrected. Prescott is more resourceful than he appears. He anticipated trouble after Fordham contacted him last month. You know where this cabin is? Winston asked. Vivian nodded. About a day's ride northwest of here near James Peak. Isolated. Defensible. She smiled slightly. Prescott was a Union artillery officer before he became a lawyer. He knows something about strategic positions. Hope kindled in Winston's chest. If Hamilton had gone to ground rather than fleeing entirely, it suggested he had information worth protecting, possibly including Fordham's whereabouts or additional copies of the evidence. We need to leave immediately, he said, rising from his chair. Not tonight, Vivian countered firmly. You're both exhausted, and the mountain trails are treacherous in darkness. Rest here tonight. Leave at dawn. I have a secure room where you won't be found if anyone comes looking. Elizabeth touched Winston's arm. She's right. We'll be more effective after some rest. Though every instinct urged immediate action, Winston recognized the wisdom in their argument. He had been pushing himself to the limits of endurance for days. Mistakes born of exhaustion could prove fatal with so much at stake. One night, he conceded. We leave at first light. Vivian showed them to a hidden room accessible through a concealed door in her workshop, a space her husband had created for storing sensitive materials and occasionally sheltering those in danger from powerful enemies. The room was small, but comfortable, with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a small window that offered both ventilation and a potential escape route if needed. No one knows about this room except me, Vivian assured them. You'll be safe here. Left alone, Winston and Elizabeth finally had a moment to properly examine Fordham's portfolio in safety. Spreading the documents across one of the beds, they methodically organized and studied each piece of evidence. The narrative is damning, Elizabeth observed as she read Fordham's personal account of the massacre. He doesn't spare himself in the telling, admits his own complicity until he could no longer stomach the killing. Winston nodded, examining a map with locations carefully marked. According to this, the main uranium deposit is here directly beneath what was the Cheyenne village. He traced a line with his finger. The gold was secondary, found in the creek beds nearby. But it provided the perfect cover story, Elizabeth added. Gold is something every miner and investor understands. Uranium is too new, too unknown. Except to the White Phoenix Society, Winston said grimly. They understood its potential value all too well. As they continued their examination, a particular document caught Winston's attention, a letter from Wallace to someone identified only as S in Washington, dated 2 weeks after the Medicine Creek Massacre. The operation proceeded as planned, though with complications requiring adjustment. Uranium samples exceed expectations in both quality and quantity. Local obstacles have been permanently removed. Regrettable but necessary casualties among our own forces have created a convenient narrative for public consumption. The phoenix rises from these ashes stronger than before. Phase 2. Funding is assured with these resources secured. Our mutual friend in Treasury confirms the banking leverage will be deployed as discussed. One minor loose end remains a survivor unaccounted for, Harlow. Presumed dead but body not recovered. Will continue search to ensure complete containment. Await your guidance on Washington timeline. The new century approaches, and with it, our destiny. Winston read the letter twice, a cold clarity settling over him. This wasn't just about land or resources, he said quietly. This was about power, reshaping the country according to their vision. Elizabeth looked up from the document she was studying. What do you mean? The White Phoenix Society isn't just a group of corrupt officials and businessmen, Winston explained. They're ideologues with a specific vision for America's future, one where they control key resources, transportation, and eventually the government itself. Through Wallace, Elizabeth realized. Their candidate for higher office. And others like him in positions of influence across the country. Winston tapped the letter. Medicine Creek was just one operation in a much larger strategy. They continued working well into the night, piecing together the extent of the conspiracy from the fragments Fordham had preserved. The more they discovered, the more apparent it became that they were confronting something far larger and more dangerous than either had initially imagined. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept fitfully on the narrow beds, each haunted by dreams of what they had learned and what still lay ahead. Dawn came too soon, gray light filtering through the small window to rouse them from uneasy sleep. Vivian provided a simple breakfast and more valuably detailed directions to Hamilton's mountain cabin, along with fresh horses and supplies. Be careful, she warned as they prepared to leave through the back alley. Wallace has men watching all the main roads out of the city. Take the old mining trails, they're harder going, but less likely to be patrolled. What about you? Elizabeth asked. If Wallace discovers you helped us. Vivian's smile was cold as mountain snow. Let him try. I've been preparing for that confrontation since Robert died. She pressed something into Elizabeth's hand, a small revolver of elegant design. Take this. It's easier to conceal than what you're carrying. As they mounted their horses, Vivian called softly after them. When this is over, when Wallace falls, I want the exclusive rights to photograph his arrest. For Robert. Winston nodded solemnly. If we succeed, I'll make sure of it. They slipped out of Denver as the city was just beginning to stir, following Vivian's directions to avoid the main thoroughfares. By mid-morning, they were climbing into the foothills northwest of the city, the sprawling frontier metropolis shrinking behind them. The trail to James Peak grew increasingly rugged as they ascended narrow paths winding through pine forests and across rocky slopes. According to Vivian's instructions, Hamilton's cabin was situated in a small valley near a mountain stream, remote enough to be defensible, yet accessible with proper guidance. They rode in watchful silence, conserving their strength for the difficult terrain. Winston's military instincts kept him alert to potential ambush points, while Elizabeth's artist's eye noted landmarks to ensure they remained on course. By late afternoon, they had climbed high enough that snow still lingered in shadowed valleys, the air thin and crisp with altitude. The path narrowed further, forcing them to proceed single file along a ridge, overlooking a steep drop. Winston, leading the way, raised his hand suddenly in a signal to halt. Elizabeth reined in her horse, watching as he dismounted, and moved cautiously forward on foot. "What is it?" she called softly. Winston knelt, examining something on the trail. "Blood," he replied grimly. "Fresh. And hoof prints. At least 6 horses passed this way recently." Elizabeth's face paled. "Wallace's men? Possibly." Winston remounted, his expression grim. "We need to hurry." They urged their tired horses to greater speed, following the blood trail as it wound deeper into the mountains. As they crested a final ridge, a small valley opened before them, cradling a log cabin nestled against a stand of pines. A thin spiral of smoke rose from its chimney, suggesting occupancy. But something was wrong. The cabin door stood open, swinging slightly in the mountain breeze. Near the front porch lay a dark form that could only be a body. "Stay here," Winston ordered, drawing his pistol. Elizabeth ignored him, dismounting and drawing her own weapon. "We do this together." They approached the cabin, cautiously alert for any movement. The body near the porch was that of a man in his 50s, well-dressed despite the remote location. A lawyer's satchel lay spilled beside him, papers scattered across ground stained dark with blood. "Prescott Hamilton," Winston said grimly, checking for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. "Shot in the back while trying to flee." Elizabeth knelt beside the body, examining the scattered papers. "These are legal documents, land deeds, mining claims." She looked up at Winston, her expression grim. "All related to properties around Medicine Creek." A soft groan from inside the cabin froze them both. Winston moved to the doorway, pistol raised, and peered inside. The cabin's interior was in disarray, furniture overturned, belongings scattered. A fire burned low in the hearth, illuminating another body slumped against the far wall. "In here," Winston called to Elizabeth, moving quickly to the wounded man. It wasn't Hamilton's assassin, as he had first thought, but another victim, a younger man in travel-worn clothing, blood staining his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. As Winston knelt beside him, the man's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty. "Harlow," he whispered, recognition and disbelief mingling in his voice. "They said you were coming, but I didn't believe." Winston studied the wounded man's face, memory stirring. Fordham, he realized. James Fordham. The man nodded weakly. "Followed me from Washington. Killed Hamilton, looking for the evidence." Elizabeth joined them, helping Winston ease Fordham into a more comfortable position. "You're the one who sent documents to Anthony Lincoln in Washington," she said. "Lincoln's dead," Fordham managed. "But the documents, safe with his daughter, Catherine Lincoln, Justice Department clerk." Hope surged through Winston. "You got the evidence to the Justice Department." Fordham shook his head, wincing with the movement. "Not yet. Catherine's hiding it, waiting for someone she can trust. Too many of Wallace's people in government." "How badly are you hurt?" Elizabeth asked, examining his wound with practiced hands. "Bad enough," Fordham replied with grim humor. "But I've lasted this long with Wallace wanting me dead. Not about to give him the satisfaction now." Winston glanced out the cabin window, calculating the fading daylight. "Wallace's men, how long ago did they leave?" "Hour, maybe 2, Fordham said. "They thought I was dead. Weren't thorough." He gestured weakly toward a loose floorboard near the hearth. "Under there. Hamilton's copy of everything." Winston pried up the indicated board, finding a metal box containing documents identical to those in Fordham's portfolio. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said, securing the new evidence. Fordham's laugh turned into a pained cough. No doctor within a day's ride would touch me once they knew who was after me. He grasped Winston's sleeve with surprising strength. Listen, Wallace is moving faster than we anticipated. The society has set something in motion, something big. Catherine has details. Where in Washington can we find her? Elizabeth asked. Boarding house on K Street, Fordham replied. Number 1299. Ask for Mrs. Fletcher's tenant. His grip on Winston's sleeve tightened. You have to get there before the end of the month. The society has plans for the centennial celebration. Winston exchanged an alarmed glance with Elizabeth. The nation's centennial was just weeks away, elaborate celebrations planned across the country to mark 100 years of American independence. What kind of plans? Winston pressed. Fordham's eyes were growing unfocused, blood loss taking its toll. Heard them talking before they shot me. Something about Philadelphia, the president. His voice faded, strength ebbing. James, Elizabeth said urgently. What about the president? Fordham rallied briefly, his gaze clearing. Assassination, he whispered. Wallace, to be the hero who saves him. Stepping stone to the White House. The implications hit Winston like a physical blow. The White Phoenix Society wasn't just planning to control resources or manipulate markets. They were orchestrating a crisis that would position Wallace as a national hero, perhaps even a presidential contender, while eliminating current leadership. We need to get this evidence to Washington immediately, Winston said, rising. Can you ride, Fordham? But James Fordham's eyes had closed, his breathing shallow. Too late for me, he murmured. 8 years too late. Go, stop them. Elizabeth checked his wound again, her expression grim. He's lost too much blood. Moving him might kill him. Leaving him certainly will, Winston countered. A sound outside the cabin silenced their debate horses approaching at speed. Winston moved to the window, cursing under his breath as he spotted riders emerging from the tree line. Wallace's men, he reported grimly. They're coming back. They must have realized Fordham wasn't dead, Elizabeth said, checking her weapon. Winston surveyed the cabin quickly, assessing their limited options. 1 door, 2 windows, minimal cover, and a wounded man who couldn't be moved quickly. The approaching riders had both numbers and the advantage of surrounding the cabin. Get Fordham behind that overturned table, he instructed Elizabeth. It's the best cover in here. As she dragged the semi-conscious man to relative safety, Winston gathered what ammunition he could find, including a shotgun from a rack on the wall and a box of shells. We're outnumbered at least 4 to 1, he told Elizabeth as she joined him at the window. Our only advantage is this defensive position. And that they don't know we're here, she added. They're expecting only a wounded Fordham. Winston nodded, formulating a desperate plan. When they approach the cabin, I'll take out as many as I can with the shotgun. That should create enough confusion for you to get Fordham to the horses and ride for that ridge. He pointed to a rocky outcropping to the east. I'll cover your retreat, then follow. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. You expect me to leave you behind? I expect you to get that evidence to Washington, Winston replied firmly. With or without me. Before she could argue further, the riders reached the clearing, 7 men spreading out to approach the cabin from multiple angles. Leading them was a face Winston recognized all too well, Major Samuel Crawford, looking grim and determined in the fading mountain light. Fordham, Crawford called. We know you're alive in there. Come out now, and I give you my word, you'll be treated fairly. Winston cocked the shotgun, his voice pitched for Elizabeth alone. Get ready to move. She caught his arm. There's another way, she whispered urgently. "The evidence is what matters not. Fordham or us. We can split up. One of us creates a diversion, while the other takes both copies of the documents to Washington." Winston considered her proposal, tactical mind weighing the odds of success. "Who does what?" "I'll take the evidence," Elizabeth said, her expression brooking no argument. "You're the soldier, you create a more convincing diversion." Though every instinct rebelled against sending her alone into danger, Winston recognized the logic. Elizabeth was less known to Wallace's men, more likely to pass unnoticed on the journey east. And if they both tried to escape with Fordham, none of them would likely make it. "Crawford's getting impatient," he observed as the major signaled his men to take positions around the cabin. "Once the shooting starts, head for the back window. There's enough cover to reach the trees if you're fast." Elizabeth nodded, accepting both portfolios and securing them inside her coat. She checked her weapons one final time, then turned to Winston with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Winston," she began, then hesitated. "If we don't—" "We will," he interrupted firmly. "This isn't goodbye, Elizabeth. It's just the next phase of the mission." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Still the soldier." "Always." Winston moved back to the window, shotgun ready. "Remember Washington, K Street, 1219, Mrs. Fletcher's tenant." "I'll be there," Elizabeth promised. "Don't you dare die again, Captain Harlow." Crawford's voice rang out once more. "Last chance, Fordham, surrender now, or we burn you out." Winston nodded to Elizabeth, then raised the shotgun and fired through the window, catching Crawford's men by surprise. Two fell immediately, a third staggering backward with a cry of pain. "Go!" Winston shouted, continuing to fire as Elizabeth dragged the semi-conscious Fordham toward the back window. The cabin erupted into chaos as Crawford's remaining men returned fire bullets, splintering wood and shattering the few intact windows. Winston maintained a steady barrage, moving between firing positions to give the impression of multiple defenders. Through the din of gunfire, he caught a glimpse of Elizabeth slipping through the back window, supporting Fordham's weight as they disappeared into the gathering darkness beyond. A surge of fierce pride accompanied his relief. She would make it. The evidence would reach Washington. Now, he just had to survive long enough to join her. Crawford's voice cut through the momentary lull in gunfire. "Harlow, I know it's you in there. You're surrounded with no way out." Winston fired another round through a different window, deliberately missing Crawford by inches. "Your aim was better at Medicine Creek, Crawford," he called back. "When you were shooting unarmed women and children." A volley of bullets answered him, forcing Winston to duck behind an overturned bookcase. The wood splintered around him, sawdust filling the air as Crawford's men intensified their fire. Night had fully claimed the mountain valley now, darkness his only ally as Winston considered his dwindling options. Elizabeth and Fordham would need time to reach safety, time he could buy with continued resistance. But his ammunition wouldn't last forever, and Crawford seemed prepared for a siege. A new sound joined the cacophony of gunfire, a whooshing, followed by the distinctive crack of flames. Looking up, Winston saw that the cabin's roof had been set alight, fiery embers beginning to fall through the rafters. Crawford's men had indeed decided to burn him out. Smoke filled the cabin with alarming speed, the dry timber of the roof catching fire easily in the mountain air. Winston pulled a bandana over his nose and mouth, crouching low where the air remained relatively clear. "Last chance, Harlow," Crawford called the flames now illuminating the clearing around the cabin. "Surrender or burn." Winston took stock of his situation with the cold clarity of a man accustomed to impossible odds. Ammunition nearly exhausted. Escape routes cut off. Cabin rapidly becoming an inferno. Yet Elizabeth was safely away with the evidence that could bring down Wallace and the White Phoenix Society. Fordham, though wounded, lived to testify about the massacre and the conspiracy. The mission could still succeed, even if he did not survive to see it. But Winston Harlow had not survived Medicine Creek, 8 years of exile and everything that followed, merely to die in a burning cabin in the Colorado mountains. Not when justice remained unserved. Not when Wallace still drew breath. With grim determination, he checked his remaining ammunition and formulated a final desperate plan. If he was going to die tonight, he would ensure his death served a purpose and take as many of Wallace's men with him as possible. As flames consumed the cabin around him, Winston prepared for a last suicidal charge into the night, unaware that fate had one final card to play in this deadly game of justice, long delayed. The cabin burned like a funeral pyre against the night sky, flames leaping hungrily through the roof and casting demonic shadows across the clearing. Through the choking smoke, Winston Harlow made his desperate calculations. 6 men surrounded this building: Crawford and 5 others. His ammunition was nearly spent, his options dwindling with each breath of superheated air. But Winston had faced death before. At Gettysburg, where Confederate artillery had shattered his leg. At Medicine Creek, where Wallace's treachery had claimed his unit. During 8 years of exile, where each winter threatened to be his last. Death was an old acquaintance, one he had no intention of meeting tonight. Crouched beneath the window on the cabin's north side, Winston assessed the terrain beyond. The darkness between the burning building and the tree line offered his only chance, a 50-yard dash through open ground likely under fire. Beyond that lay wilderness mountains and the slim hope of survival. He ripped a strip of fabric from his shirt, soaking it in water from a bucket that had miraculously survived the inferno. Wrapping the damp cloth around his nose and mouth, he prepared for his final gambit. "Crawford!" he shouted over the roar of the flames. "I'm coming out! Don't shoot!" A pause in the gunfire suggested the major had heard him. "Throw out your weapons first, Harlow," Crawford called back. Winston permitted himself a grim smile. He had no intention of surrendering, but every second Crawford believed he might was another second for Elizabeth to put distance between herself and this death trap. "I'm sending Fordham out first," Winston shouted, playing for time. "He needs medical attention." This lie would buy precious moments of confusion when Winston emerged alone, moments he would use to maximum advantage. Gathering the last of his strength, Winston kicked out what remained of the window frame, then hurled himself through the opening. He hit the ground hard, rolling instantly toward the meager shelter of a woodpile as bullets tore through the space he had occupied seconds before. "He's alone," someone shouted. "Fordham's not with him. The woman must have him." Crawford bellowed. "2 of you check the back. The rest take Harlow." Winston fired his remaining pistol rounds at the muzzle flashes, then abandoned the empty weapon and sprinted for the tree line. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, one grazing his arm with a white-hot slash of pain he barely registered. 50 yards became 30, then 20, the dark sanctuary of the forest, drawing closer with each desperate stride. A shadow detached itself from the trees ahead, one of Crawford's men cutting off his escape. Winston didn't break stride, lowering his shoulder and crashing into the man with the full momentum of his run. They went down together, rolling in the dirt, as Winston fought for control of the man's rifle. A knee to the groin gave Winston the advantage. He wrenched the weapon free and slammed its stock into the man's temple, leaving him unconscious as Winston regained his feet and plunged into the forest. Behind him, Crawford's voice rose above the chaos. "Spread out! Find him! Wallace wants him dead by dawn." Winston moved deeper into the woods, using the skills honed during his years in the Montana wilderness to navigate by starlight. His damaged leg protested each step, the old wound reawakened by exertion and the cold mountain air. But pain was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with Crawford's men pursuing and Elizabeth's life depending on his ability to draw them away from her trail. For hours, Winston led his hunters on a grueling chase through the mountain terrain, doubling back, crossing streams to mask his scent, using every trick he had learned from both military training and frontier survival. By midnight, the sounds of pursuit had faded, the hunters either lost or regrouping for a dawn search. Only then did Winston permit himself a brief rest, finding shelter beneath a rocky overhang that offered some protection from the biting cold. His arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed it, blood stiffening the fabric of his sleeve. Using snow from a nearby drift, he cleaned the wound as best he could, then bound it with a strip torn from his shirt. As adrenaline ebbed, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. Winston fought it, forcing his mind to focus on the next steps. Elizabeth would be heading east with Fordham, and the evidence assuming they had escaped Crawford's men. His priority now was to reach Washington and rendezvous with her while continuing to draw Wallace's attention away from her trail. But Washington was nearly 2,000 miles distant, and he was alone in the Colorado wilderness with minimal supplies, a stolen rifle with limited ammunition, and enemies actively hunting him. The odds were challenging. Winston permitted himself a grim smile. Challenging odds had become his natural habitat since Medicine Creek. Dawn found him moving again, heading eastward on a parallel course to the one Elizabeth would likely take. He avoided settlements and main roads, knowing Wallace's influence would have spread word of his description far and wide. Instead, he traveled cross-country hunting for food, sleeping in hidden places, becoming once more the ghost he had been for 8 years. 3 days into this solitary journey, Winston encountered the first sign that fate hadn't entirely abandoned him. Cresting a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, he spotted a small encampment below teepees arranged in the distinctive circle of a Cheyenne hunting party. For a moment, Winston considered avoiding them. Not all Cheyenne would view a white man, particularly a former cavalry officer, with friendly eyes. But desperation overrode caution. If these were Standing Bear's people, they might offer assistance in memory of his actions at Medicine Creek. Decision made. Winston approached openly, rifle held non-threateningly across his body. Sentries spotted him immediately, warriors materializing from concealment with weapons ready. Winston stopped at a respectful distance, raising his empty hand in greeting. "I seek Gray Shield, son of Standing Bear," he called in the few words of Cheyenne he knew, then continued in English. "I am Winston Harlow." The name produced an immediate reaction among the warriors. They conferred briefly, then one approached, studying Winston with wary interest. "The white soldier returns again," he said in accented English. "Gray Shield spoke of meeting you. He is not here, but I am Black Kettle cousin to Standing Bear." Winston recognized the name, a prominent warrior who had earned respect among both his people and white settlers for his diplomatic skills. "I need help reaching the eastern settlements," Winston explained. "Wallace's men hunt me." Black Kettle's expression hardened at Wallace's name. "The butcher of Medicine Creek. You fight against him now." "Yes, to bring justice for what happened there." The warrior considered this, then nodded once. "Come, we will speak with the elders." The Cheyenne camp received Winston with cautious hospitality. He was given food and a place by the fire while Black Kettle conferred with the hunting party's leader, an elderly man named Broken Lance. Winston ate gratefully, aware of curious eyes watching his every move, particularly those of the children who had likely never seen a white man sitting peacefully in their camp. Eventually, Broken Lance approached, seating himself across the fire from Winston. His face was a map of years, and hardship eyes sharp with the wisdom of survival. "Black Kettle says you fight against Wallace," he said without preamble. "Why should we believe this? You wore the blue coat that brought death to our people." Winston met the elder's gaze directly. "I wore it, yes. I also disobeyed orders when those orders meant killing innocent people. For that, Wallace tried to kill me and my men." "So you seek revenge?" "Justice," Winston corrected. "Not just for myself, but for everyone Wallace has harmed, including your people at Medicine Creek." Broken Lance studied him silently, weighing truth against experience. Finally he spoke again. "Standing Bear's son told us of your return. He said the spirits had sent you back from death to bring truth into the light." The old man's expression remained impassive. "I do not know about spirits, but I know Wallace still lives, still grows in power, while our people diminish year by year." "He won't remain in power much longer," Winston assured him. "Not if the evidence we've gathered reaches Washington. A woman travels east now carrying proof of Wallace's crimes. If she reaches Washington before Wallace's men find her, his power will end." Broken Lance exchanged glances with Black Kettle. Some unspoken communication passed between them. "This woman," Black Kettle said carefully, "she travels with a wounded man." Winston's pulse quickened. "Yes, James Fordham. Have you seen them?" Broken Lance nodded once. 2 days ago, Army men pursued them. We discouraged the pursuit." Relief washed through Winston. Elizabeth and Fordham had survived Crawford's initial search. "Where were they headed?" "The Iron Road," Black Kettle replied, "to catch the fire horse eastward." "The railroad." "Of course. Elizabeth would seek the fastest route to Washington now that the immediate danger had passed, but that meant passing through settlements where Wallace's influence was strong. "I need to follow them," Winston said urgently. "Protect them if Wallace's men are still searching." Broken Lance and Black Kettle conferred again this time in their native tongue. Winston waited, understanding that his request involved significant risk for the Cheyenne. Helping a white man wanted by territorial authorities could bring harsh reprisals against a people already fighting for survival. "We will help you reach the Iron Road," Broken Lance finally announced. "Not for you, but for those who died at Medicine Creek without justice. Their spirits still cry out from the earth." Winston bowed his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you." "Do not thank us yet, white soldier," Black Kettle cautioned. "The journey remains dangerous, and Wallace has many eyes along the way." That night, as the camp settled into the rhythms of sleep, Winston sat by the dying fire contemplating the strange turns his life had taken. From Union officer to fugitive, from exile to avenger, a path he could never have imagined when he first pinned on a lieutenant's bars more than a decade earlier. And now his fate was entwined with a determined artist seeking justice for her sister, a wounded former enemy who had found conscience too late, and a native people whom he had once been ordered to subjugate. Life had a particular talent for irony. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a young Cheyenne woman who placed a small bundle beside him. "Medicine," she explained shyly in halting English. "For your arm." Winston thanked her, unwrapping the bundle to find herbs and a poultice that smelled strongly of pine and something more pungent. The woman demonstrated how to apply it to his wounded arm, her touch clinical and efficient. "You fought at Medicine Creek?" she asked as she worked. Winston nodded grimly. "I tried to stop it." "My grandmother died there," she said simply without accusation. "And my young brother." Winston had no response to this quiet statement of loss. No words that could possibly address the magnitude of what had happened. "I'm sorry," he finally said, knowing the inadequacy of the sentiment even as he offered it. The woman finished binding his arm, then met his gaze directly. "Black Kettle says you will bring the truth to the white chief in Washington, that Wallace will face judgment." "If I reach Washington alive," Winston confirmed, "that's my intention." She rose, gathering her supplies. "Then I will ask the spirits to protect your journey, not for you, but for my grandmother, for my brother, for all who cry out from the earth." With that, she left him to his thoughts and the dying fire. Dawn brought preparation for departure. The Cheyenne provided Winston with a sturdy pony pemmican for the journey and most precious of all detailed knowledge of the terrain between their camp and the railroad. Black Kettle himself would guide Winston part of the way, ensuring he avoided army patrols and settlements where Wallace's influence was strongest. As they rode out, Broken Lance offered a final piece of advice. "Trust no white man until you reach Washington," he counseled. "Wallace's reach is long and gold makes many tongues speak." Winston acknowledged the wisdom with a nod. "I'll remember." The journey with Black Kettle took 2 days of hard riding through terrain few white men had ever traversed. The warrior's knowledge of the land was uncanny, finding passes through seemingly impassable mountains and water sources in apparent wasteland. They traveled in companionable silence, each respecting the other's self-sufficiency. On the evening of the second day, they reached a ridge overlooking the railroad. Below, the tracks stretched east and west, like an iron lifeline connecting the frontier to civilization. A small settlement huddled around the depot Graham's station, barely more than a water stop for the steam engines that thundered through 3 times weekly. "The eastbound train comes tomorrow at midday," Black Kettle informed him. "This is where we part ways." Winston offered his hand, which the warrior clasped firmly. "Thank you, Black Kettle. I won't forget your help." "Do not thank me," the Cheyenne replied, with the ghost of a smile. "Thank me when Wallace falls, when justice comes for Medicine Creek." "It will," Winston promised, "one way or another." Black Kettle studied him for a moment, then reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something small and white. He pressed it into Winston's palm, a carved eagle feather fashioned from bone. "Show this to any Cheyenne you meet," he instructed. "They will know you as a friend to our people." With a final nod, Black Kettle wheeled his pony and disappeared back into the wilderness, leaving Winston alone on the ridge with the carved token and the knowledge that his next steps would take him back into the world of white men and the more immediate danger of Wallace's influence. Winston spent the night in a sheltered hollow considering his approach to Graham's station. Appearing as himself was obviously impossible. Wallace would have telegraphed his description to every station along the line. He needed a disguise, a new identity to carry him east. By morning, he had formulated a plan. Using mud from a nearby creek, he darkened his beard and hair to gray, stooping his posture to appear older and frailer than his years. A careful application of dirt and grease to his clothing completed the transformation from military officer to aging prospector down on his luck. Thus disguised, Winston approached Graham's station shortly before the eastbound train was due. The settlement consisted of little more than the depot, a general store, and a small saloon that doubled as a hotel for passengers awaiting connections. A handful of buildings clustered around these establishments, housing railroad workers and the few permanent residents. Winston entered the general store, affecting the shuffling gait of a man whose joints protested every movement. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with mutton-chop whiskers, eyed him with the automatic wariness frontier merchants reserved for customers of uncertain means. "Help you?" he asked, not pausing in his task of stacking canned goods. "Need a ticket east," Winston replied, deliberately roughening his voice. "Denver, maybe Chicago if my dust stretches that far." The mention of gold dust sparked immediate interest. The proprietor set down his cans and gave Winston his full attention. "Ticket office is at the depot," he said. "But train ain't due for another hour. Coffee while you wait 5 cents. Winston nodded, placing a small nugget on the counterpart of the emergency supply he had carried since leaving Montana. The proprietor's eyes widened slightly at the size of the payment. "That'll buy a lot of coffee," he observed, reaching for the nugget. "Keep the change," Winston said, "in exchange for information." The man pocketed the gold with practiced casualness. "What sort of information?" "Looking for 2 friends who might have come through recently. Woman artist, traveling with a man who might have been injured. Heading east, like me." The proprietor's expression shifted subtly, a wariness entering his eyes. "Don't recall any artists," he said carefully. "Lot of folks pass through here, don't pay much attention." Winston recognized the lie immediately, but gave no sign. Instead, he nodded in apparent acceptance and took the offered coffee, settling onto a barrel to sip the bitter brew. The proprietor returned to his stocking, but Winston noticed how the man's gaze kept drifting to the door, as if expecting someone. Wallace's influence had indeed reached even this remote outpost. The question was whether the proprietor had merely been instructed to report Winston's appearance, or if a more immediate danger lurked nearby. The answer came 15 minutes later, when 2 men entered the store. Their clothes marked them as ordinary travelers, but the way they carried themselves and the telltale bulges beneath their coats identified them to Winston's experienced eye as Pinkerton agents or similar professionals. "Mr. Hobson," one greeted the proprietor. "Any new arrivals today?" The proprietor's eyes flicked briefly to Winston, then away. "Just this gentleman," he replied. "Looking for the eastbound." Both men turned their attention to Winston, assessing him with the calculated scrutiny of predators. Winston maintained his elderly prospector persona, hands shaking slightly as he raised his coffee cup, eyes downcast, as if intimidated by their presence. "What brings you to Graham's Station, old-timer?" the taller agent asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Played out my claim up Montana way," Winston mumbled. "Heading back east while I still got something to show for 20 years hard digging." "Montana, huh?" The second agent stepped closer. "Long way from home," Winston shrugged. "Ain't got no home, 'cept where I hang my hat. Been that way since before the war." "Which side did you favor in that conflict?" the first agent asked sharply. Winston spat into the sawdust on the floor. "Neither. War's for young fools. I was hunting color, while other men hunted each other." The agents exchanged glances, seemingly satisfied with his performance. As they turned their attention back to the proprietor, Winston carefully observed their positions and movements, calculating odds and options should his disguise fail. "Any sign of the woman and her companion?" the taller agent asked Hobson. The proprietor shook his head. "Like I told the others, they bought tickets to Denver 2 days ago. Haven't seen 'em since." Winston's heart quickened. Elizabeth and Fordham had passed this way, and recently, but the agent's questions suggested they had not been captured yet. "General Wallace is offering $5,000 for information leading to their apprehension," the second agent announced loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Same for the man traveling with them, the one calling himself Captain Harlow." The sum was enormous, more than most frontier settlers would see in a lifetime. Winston maintained his disinterested facade, though his mind raced with implications. Wallace was growing desperate, raising the stakes to ensure every opportunist in the territory would be hunting Elizabeth and Fordham and him. "Train's coming," someone called from outside, the distant whistle confirming the announcement. The agents departed for the depot, clearly intending to inspect arriving and departing passengers. Winston remained in the store until they were out of sight, then approached the proprietor again. "Sounds like excitement," he commented mildly. $5,000 would buy a lot of goods for your store. Hobson's expression turned calculating. More than you offered for information that's certain. Winston leaned closer, dropping the prospector's affect. But my gold is in your pocket now, while Wallace's remains a promise that may never be fulfilled. The man's eyes widened slightly at the change in Winston's demeanor. Who are you? Someone who values truth, Winston replied, and who pays his debts. Now about my friends. Where did they really go? Hobson hesitated, clearly weighing risks against rewards. Finally, his hand drifted to the gold nugget in his pocket. They didn't take the eastbound, he admitted quietly. Woman said it wasn't safe, too many eyes watching. They hired a wagon instead, heading southeast toward the Kansas line. Said something about catching the train at Fort Wallace instead. Winston nodded, understanding Elizabeth's strategy. Fort Wallace, despite sharing the general's name, was far enough from his center of power that they might board a train with less scrutiny. One more question, Winston said. How many of Wallace's men have come through looking for them? 6 yesterday. Those 2 today. Hobson glanced nervously toward the door. Plus telegraph messages to every station master within 500 miles. He really wants them found. Thank you for your honesty, Winston said, then added pointedly, I trust you'll extend the same courtesy to the next person who asks about me. The threat was subtle but clear. Hobson swallowed and nodded. Train's leaving in 10 minutes. Best hurry if you want a ticket. Winston departed the store and made his way to the depot, maintaining his elderly disguise. The platform bustled with the controlled chaos of a frontier train stop. Passengers boarding and disembarking freight, being loaded, railroad workers shouting instructions over the hissing steam of the waiting locomotive. The 2 agents stood near the ticket office, scrutinizing each passenger. Winston shuffled past them to purchase a ticket to Denver, keeping his head down and his voice quavering. The disguise held. They barely glanced at him before returning their attention to more promising suspects. Boarding the train, Winston found a seat in the rear of the last passenger car, positioning himself to observe without being observed. As the train lurched into motion, he permitted himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He had successfully navigated the first major hurdle in his journey east, but many more remained before he could reach Washington and whatever rendezvous Elizabeth had established. The train had been underway for perhaps an hour when Winston noticed a disturbance moving through the cars ahead. Conductors and brakemen were moving purposefully from car to car, checking passengers with unusual scrutiny. A moment later, the door at the front of his car opened to admit one of the agents from Graham's station, accompanied by the conductor. Routine security check, the conductor announced, by order of the territorial governor. Everyone, please have identification ready. Winston tensed, calculating options. His disguise might fool a casual inspection, but not a determined investigation by men specifically hunting him. And he carried no identification beyond the military papers in his real name. As the agent moved methodically down the aisle, Winston casually shifted his gaze to the window, assessing the terrain passing outside. The train was crossing a long, gentle grade, its speed reduced to navigate the incline. Beyond the tracks lay open prairie, nowhere to hide, but not impossible to cross if necessary. The agent was now just 2 rows away, checking the papers of an elderly couple who appeared flustered by the unexpected scrutiny. Winston's hand drifted to the revolver concealed beneath his coat, though he had no desire to add shooting a law enforcement officer to the list of charges Wallace had undoubtedly fabricated against him. Just as the agent finished with the elderly couple and turned his attention toward Winston's row, fate intervened in the form of a tremendous lurch that sent everyone stumbling. The train's brakes squealed in protest as it ground to an abrupt halt, passengers crying out in alarm as they were thrown against seats and each other. "What the devil?" the conductor exclaimed, struggling to maintain his balance. "Obstruction on the track," someone shouted from outside. The agent abandoned his inspection and pushed toward the front of the car, the conductor following close behind. Winston remained seated, watchful as other passengers crowded toward windows to glimpse the cause of their unexpected stop. "Looks like a landslide," reported a man peering through the window opposite Winston. "Bunch of rocks across the tracks." The delay was both opportunity and threat. If the train remained stopped for long, a more thorough inspection of passengers might follow. Yet the confusion provided cover for Winston to potentially slip away unnoticed. Decision made, he rose and moved casually toward the rear platform of the car, adopting the air of a curious passenger rather than an escaping fugitive. Outside, most attention was focused on the front of the train, where railroad workers were already assessing the obstruction. Winston descended the steps on the opposite side, putting the bulk of the train between himself and the majority of passengers and crew. Once on the ground, he walked purposefully away from the tracks, as if heading to inspect the obstruction from a different angle. Only when he had put sufficient distance between himself and the train did he veer toward a shallow ravine that offered some concealment. From this vantage point, Winston observed the scene with growing suspicion. The landslide consisted of boulders too neatly arranged to be natural, positioned precisely to stop the train without derailing it. This was no accident. It was an ambush. His suspicion was confirmed moments later when riders appeared on the ridge above the tracks, at least a dozen men, several wearing the distinctive duster coats favored by Pinkerton agents. They approached the train in a coordinated pattern that spoke of military or law enforcement training. Wallace had escalated beyond mere pursuit. He was now orchestrating direct interdiction of potential escape routes, willing to stop an entire train to prevent Winston, Elizabeth, and Fordham from reaching Washington with their evidence. Fortunately, Elizabeth's foresight in avoiding the obvious route east had spared her this particular trap. Winston could only hope her journey toward Fort Wallace remained equally undetected. As for himself, the changed circumstances necessitated a revised plan. The train was no longer a viable option. Even if the tracks were cleared, security would be heightened after this incident. He would need to continue overland, perhaps acquiring a horse at the next settlement. For now, Winston retreated deeper into the ravine, using its concealment to put distance between himself and Wallace's men. The vastness of the western frontier, once his prison during 8 years of exile, now offered his best chance at continued freedom and eventual justice. By nightfall, Winston had covered nearly 10 miles across the rolling prairie, keeping the railroad to his north as a navigation reference while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid patrols. The physical toll was considerable. His damaged leg protested each mile with increasing vehemence, and the bullet graze on his arm, though treated by the Cheyenne medicine, throbbed in steady counterpoint to his heartbeat. Finding shelter in a cluster of boulders reminiscent of those used to stop the train, Winston permitted himself a brief rest. He consumed a small portion of the pemmican provided by the Cheyenne rationing carefully against the uncertain journey ahead. As stars emerged in the vast prairie sky, Winston found his thoughts turning to Elizabeth. Had she and Fordham reached Fort Wallace safely? Were they even now aboard an eastbound train, the precious evidence secure in their possession? Or had Wallace's net closed around them as it had nearly trapped him? The questions had no immediate answers yet. They occupied his mind as exhaustion finally claimed him, drawing him into uneasy sleep beneath the indifferent stars. Dawn found Winston moving again, body stiff from cold and the previous day's exertion, but resolve undiminished. His path took him southeast, following Hobson's information about Elizabeth's intended route. If he maintained his current pace, he might reach Fort Wallace within 4 days, potentially intercepting Elizabeth and Fordham before they departed for Washington. The third day of this journey brought Winston to a small homestead nestled in a shallow valley, the first human habitation he had encountered since leaving the railroad. Smoke rose from the chimney of a modest cabin, a few cattle grazing in a nearby pasture. Under normal circumstances, frontier hospitality would make such a place a welcome rest stop for a traveler. But these were not normal circumstances. Wallace's bounty meant that any stranger might view Winston as a lucrative prize rather than a guest deserving assistance. Still, his supplies were dwindling, and the opportunity to acquire a horse might be worth the risk of limited contact. Decision made, Winston approached openly, hands visible to show peaceful intent. A woman emerged from the cabin at his approach, a shotgun held competently, but not threateningly, across her body. She was perhaps 40, with the weathered features and practical clothing of someone who had carved a life from the unforgiving prairie. "That's far enough, stranger," she called when Winston was still 30 yards distant. "State your business." "Looking to trade for supplies," Winston replied honestly. "And possibly a horse, if you have one to spare." The woman studied him with narrowed eyes. "Trade with what you don't look like you're carrying much worth having." Winston reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew one of his remaining gold nuggets. "I can pay fairly." This changed the woman's calculation visibly. She lowered the shotgun slightly, though remained watchful. "My husband's not here. Won't be back till sundown." Winston recognized this as both warning and useful information. "I understand your caution, ma'am. I'm not looking for trouble, just supplies." After a moment's further consideration, the woman nodded once. "Come ahead, then, but leave any weapons at the edge of the yard." Winston complied, placing his rifle and revolver on a stump before approaching the cabin. The woman's wariness was entirely reasonable for a frontier wife alone with a stranger, regardless of Wallace's bounty. That she had invited him closer at all spoke to the powerful attraction of gold, in a region where hard currency was perpetually scarce. "Sarah Kingsley," she introduced herself as Winston reached the cabin. "Coffee." "Much appreciated," Winston replied deliberately, not offering a name in return. Inside the cabin was modest, but meticulously maintained with the accumulated comforts of what appeared to be years of settlement. Proper furniture, curtains at the windows, a shelf of books beside the stone fireplace. Mrs. Kingsley gestured Winston to a chair at the rough-hewn table while she prepared coffee. "Not many travelers this way." She observed her tone casual, but her attention clearly focused on assessing her visitor. "Most follow the stage road 10 miles north." "Prefer the quiet," Winston replied with equal casualness. "Less chance of unpleasant encounters." Mrs. Kingsley's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Running from something, then." It wasn't a question, and Winston didn't treat it as one. He accepted the coffee she offered, savoring the rich aroma after days of cold camps and limited rations. "What supplies were you looking for?" Mrs. Kingsley asked after a moment. "Food for a few days' travel. Ammunition, if you can spare it. And as I said, a horse, if possible." She considered this, then nodded. "Can help with food and ammunition. Horse is trickier. We've only 3. And my husband needs 2 for his work." She studied Winston over the rim of her coffee cup. "Though I suppose he'd consider selling one for the right price, especially to someone with gold." "I can pay fairly," Winston repeated, though he was beginning to sense an undercurrent to the conversation that made him increasingly wary. Mrs. Kingsley set down her cup. "I'm sure you can, Captain Harlow." Winston froze coffee halfway to his lips. "I didn't give my name." "Didn't need to." She nodded toward the telegraph form pinned beside the door, a notice describing Winston in detail and offering $5,000 for his capture. "That arrived yesterday. Seems General Wallace is mighty eager to speak with you." Winston carefully set down his cup, mind racing through limited options. His weapons lay outside, and Mrs. Kingsley still had her shotgun within easy reach. Even if he overpowered her, something he had no desire to attempt against a frontier woman simply protecting her home. Her husband would return by sundown, potentially with others. "I see," he said finally. "And will you be claiming that reward, Mrs. Kingsley?" To his surprise, she laughed a sharp, bitter sound, with no humor in it. "That would require believing anything that comes from Thaddeus Wallace. A mistake I've already made once to my everlasting regret." Winston's brow furrowed in confusion. "You know Wallace." "I knew him," she corrected. "During the war. My first husband served under him at Shiloh." Her expression hardened. Wallace ordered his company to hold an impossible position, then denied sending the order when half the men were slaughtered. Called my Robert a liar to his face, said he must have misunderstood the command. Understanding dawned. "I'm sorry for your loss." "It was a long time ago," Mrs. Kingsley replied, though her tone suggested the wound remained fresh. "Found happiness again with John Kingsley. Built this place together." She gestured around the cabin. "But I never forgot how Wallace sacrificed good men for his ambition, then denied responsibility when it went wrong." She rose and moved to the telegraph notice, tearing it from the wall with deliberate contempt. "So no, Captain Harlow, I won't be claiming Wallace's blood money. Whatever quarrel lies between you, I suspect you have more right on your side than he does." Relief washed through Winston, though caution remained his companion. "Thank you for your understanding." Mrs. Kingsley waved away his gratitude. "Don't thank me yet. My husband mightn't share my sentiments. John's a practical man, and $5,000 would buy a lot of cattle." She glanced out the window at the position of the sun. "Which means you should be gone before he returns at sundown." She moved efficiently around the cabin, gathering supplies into a canvas sack. Jerky, hardtack coffee ammunition for his revolver. "Can't spare a horse," she said apologetically. "But John has a mule he uses for hunting, old and mean-tempered, but sound enough, that I can let you have without him noticing its absence for a day or two." Winston accepted the supplies with genuine gratitude. "You're taking a considerable risk, Mrs. Kingsley. If Wallace discovers you've helped me, Wallace is 200 miles away and I've faced worse risks than his displeasure," she interrupted. "Besides, John will assume the mule wandered off again. Does it at least once a month." She led Winston to a small barn behind the cabin, where she saddled an elderly mule that regarded both humans with undisguised contempt. "His name's General," she said with a hint of dark humor, "on account of his stubbornness and tendency to charge into trouble." Winston secured his supplies to the saddle, then turned to the remarkable woman who had chosen justice over reward. "I don't know how to properly thank you." "Don't try," she replied simply. "Just make sure whatever you're doing hurts Wallace. That's thanks enough." With a final nod of respect, Winston mounted the reluctant mule and set off southeastward, following Mrs. Kingsley's directions toward Fort Wallace. Behind him, she returned to her cabin, one more unexpected ally in a world Winston had long assumed held only enemies. The mule, true to Mrs. Kingsley's description, proved both stubborn and, surprisingly, hardy. It maintained a steady pace across the prairie, occasionally voicing its displeasure with braying protests, but never actually refusing to continue. Winston found himself developing a reluctant appreciation for the cantankerous animal whose ornery resilience matched his own. 2 days of hard travel brought him within sight of Fort Wallace, not a true fort in the military sense, but a trading post that had grown into a small settlement serving as a transportation hub for the surrounding region. From a ridge overlooking the town, Winston observed the comings and goings, noting with concern the unusually high number of men who carried themselves with the distinctive bearing of law enforcement or private security. Wallace's influence had clearly reached this outpost as well. Entering openly would be suicidal, yet Winston needed to determine whether Elizabeth and Fordham had passed through, and if so, whether they had successfully continued eastward. As dusk approached, Winston left General tethered in a sheltered ravine with adequate grazing, then approached the settlement on foot. He circled to the southern edge, where several storage buildings offered concealment, allowing him to observe without immediately being observed. The railroad depot formed the heart of Fort Wallace, a sturdy structure adjoining a water tower where steam locomotives replenished their critical supplies. A telegraph office occupied one end of the depot building, its windows still illuminated despite the late hour. If Elizabeth had passed through or sent messages, records would exist there. Winston watched as the settlement gradually quieted, businesses closing for the night, residents retiring to their homes. Only the saloon showed continued activity light and occasional bursts of laughter spilling from its doors and windows. When full darkness had settled, Winston made his move, approaching the depot from the least visible angle. The telegraph office door was locked as expected, but a window at the rear yielded to careful pressure, allowing him to slip inside undetected. The office was small and orderly, dominated by the telegraph equipment on the main desk. Winston located the message logs, quickly bound ledgers recording all transmissions sent and received. Working by the dim light filtering through the windows from the street lamps outside, he searched the most recent entries. There, 2 days earlier, a message sent to Denver addressed to V. Montgomery. The text was brief. Proceeding as planned. Alternative route secured. Meet as arranged. E. Elizabeth had indeed passed through Fort Wallace and had contacted Vivian Montgomery in Denver. More importantly, she had secured passage eastward by some means other than the regular train service, which would be closely watched by Wallace's men. Winston continued searching the logs, looking for any response from Montgomery or other messages that might indicate Elizabeth's specific route. He found nothing definitive, though several incoming telegrams from Denver and Pueblo requesting information about suspects fitting description suggested Wallace's net was tightening across the territory. As Winston prepared to leave, a final entry caught his attention, a message from Washington, D.C., addressed simply to Captain W. H. Fort Wallace. The content was equally cryptic. K Street arrangements confirmed. CL awaits evidence by month's end. Godspeed. The message had arrived that very morning. Winston stared at it in amazement, realizing Elizabeth must have anticipated he would check the telegraph office and arranged for this communication to guide him if they became separated. CL would be Catherine Lincoln, daughter of the murdered Interior Department investigator and current Justice Department clerk. Most crucially, the message confirmed the Washington rendezvous point mentioned by Fordham K Street, presumably the boarding house at 1219 where Catherine Lincoln could be contacted. And the deadline remained unchanged, the end of the month, before whatever the White Phoenix Society had planned for the centennial celebration. Winston carefully returned the ledgers to their original positions, then slipped out through the window he had entered. As he eased it closed, voices approaching from the street froze him in mid-motion. Checking every settlement between here and Denver, a man was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. Crawford's certain they passed through Fort Wallace heading east. Any sign of Harlow? A second voice asked. Nothing confirmed. Last sighting was that train stop 3 days back, but he gave them the slip somehow. Wallace is offering $10,000 now for Harlow alone. Dead or alive? The voices faded as the men passed the corner of the building, continuing toward the saloon. Winston remained motionless in the shadows until he was certain they were gone, then made his way carefully back toward the ravine where he had left General. The increased bounty on his head confirmed what Winston already suspected. Wallace was growing increasingly desperate as the deadline approached. $10,000 would turn every opportunist lawman and bounty hunter in the territory into an active hunter making further travel by conventional means virtually impossible. Yet the telegraph message had renewed Winston's determination. Elizabeth had successfully continued eastward. She was proceeding according to plan, making her way toward Washington with the evidence that could bring down Wallace and the White Phoenix Society. All he needed to do was follow her trail and provide whatever support she might need at the critical moment. Returning to the cantankerous mule, Winston considered his options. The main roads and railways would be closely watched. Regular stagecoach routes would be similarly monitored. He needed an alternative, something unexpected, that Wallace's men wouldn't anticipate. As he pondered this challenge, Winston recalled Black Kettle's parting gift, the carved bone eagle feather that would identify him as a friend to the Cheyenne. Perhaps there lay his answer. The native tribes maintained their own networks of communication and travel across territories that white authorities considered impassable or uninhabited. With their help, he might bypass Wallace's surveillance entirely. Decision made, Winston mounted General and turned northeast away from Fort Wallace and the main eastward routes. Dawn would find him seeking the nearest Cheyenne encampment, where he would call upon the debt of Medicine Creek once more. The path to Washington and justice remained long and fraught with danger. But for the first time since receiving Clement's letter, Winston felt the stirring of something he had almost forgotten: hope. Hope that truth might finally emerge from shadow. Hope that the dead of Medicine Creek might at last find justice. Hope that the living might forge a future free from the corruption that Wallace and his White Phoenix Society represented. It was a fragile hope easily broken by the 1,000 perils that still lay between him and Washington. But it was hope, nonetheless, a flame rekindled after 8 years of darkness. And Winston Harlow, once dead, but now very much alive, intended to nurture that flame into a blaze that would illuminate even the darkest corners of Wallace's conspiracy.